The morning mist clung to the fields outside Paris in the spring of 1315, but the peasants who emerged from their cramped cottages found no comfort in the familiar sight. The grain stalks that should have stood tall and golden lay flattened against the waterlogged earth, victims of the relentless rains that had pounded northern Europe for months. This scene repeated itself across thousands of villages from England to Poland, marking the beginning of what historians would later call the Great Famine, a catastrophe that would fundamentally weaken European society and create the perfect conditions for an even greater disaster to follow. Europe in the early 14th century stood at a demographic precipice. The population had grown dramatically during the medieval warm period, with estimates suggesting that by 1300, the continent supported between 70 and 80 million inhabitants, a number not seen since the height of the Roman Empire, and one that would not be reached again until the 16th century. This population boom had pushed medieval agricultural technology to its absolute limits. Every available piece of arable land had been pressed into service, including marginal soils on hillsides and in forests that previous generations had wisely left uncultivated. The agricultural system that supported this massive population operated on razor-thin margins. Medieval farming techniques, while sophisticated for their time, remained fundamentally limited by available technology and knowledge. The three-field system dominated northern European agriculture, where peasants divided their holdings into three sections, one planted with winter crops like wheat or rye, another with spring crops such as oats or barley, and the third left fallow to recover fertility. This system, combined with the heavy, wheeled plough and the horse collar, had enabled the agricultural revolution that supported population growth. But it had reached its productive ceiling. Peasant families typically survived on a diet dominated by grain, bread, porridge and ale formed the foundation of their nutrition. A single harvest failure could spell disaster for entire communities. Most households maintained grain stores sufficient for only a few months, and even prosperous peasants rarely held reserves lasting more than a year. The margin between survival and starvation remained perilously narrow for the vast majority of Europe's population. When the rains began in the spring of 1315, they seemed like a divine punishment. Contemporary chroniclers described downpours that lasted for weeks, turning fields into quagmires and making normal agricultural work impossible. The monk John of Trocolo wrote of floods that swept away entire villages, while the annals of Bermondsey recorded grain prices rising to levels that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. In England, wheat prices increased by 800% between 1315 and 1317. Similar price spikes occurred across the continent, from the Low Countries to the German states. The demographic consequences proved devastating. Historical records from English manors show mortality rates climbing to 15% above normal levels during the worst years of the famine. In some regions, particularly in northern France and the Low Countries, death rates may have reached 25% of the population. Children and the elderly died first, but working-age adults also succumbed in large numbers to diseases that thrived among malnourished populations. Typhus, dysentery, and various fevers swept through communities already weakened by hunger. This crisis fundamentally altered European society's resilience. The generation that survived the Great Famine carried physical and psychological scars that would make them more vulnerable to future catastrophes. Malnutrition during childhood stunted growth and compromised immune systems, creating a population more susceptible to epidemic disease. Archaeological evidence from cemetery excavations reveals decreased average height and increased bone pathologies among individuals who lived through the famine years. As Europe struggled with these internal crises, the continent's integration into vast trade networks continued to accelerate. The Silk Road, that legendary chain of trading routes connecting east and west, had evolved far beyond its classical origins. By the early 14th century, a complex web of commercial relationships linked European merchants with traders from the Black Sea, Central Asia, India, and China. Italian merchant houses, particularly those from Venice, Genoa and Pisa, maintained permanent trading posts from Constantinople to Caffa on the Crimean Peninsula. These trade routes carried far more than silk and spices. Venetian galleys returning from the east brought Chinese porcelain, Indian pepper and Central Asian furs, but they also transported less visible cargo, the rats, fleas and microorganisms that thrived in the holds of merchant vessels. The same commercial networks that brought prosperity to European cities would soon serve as highways for disease transmission. Caffa, the Genoese trading colony on the Black Sea, exemplified the interconnected nature of 14th century commerce. This fortified port city housed Italian merchants alongside Greek, Armenian and Mongol traders. Caravans arrived regularly from Samarkand and Bukhara, carrying goods that had originated in China or India. The city's warehouses stored vast quantities of grain from the Ukrainian steppes, destined for Constantinople and the Italian city-states. Ships departed regularly for Venice, Genoa and other Mediterranean ports, their holds packed with Eastern luxuries and their crews representing a dozen different nationalities. Urbanisation accelerated throughout the 13th and early 14th centuries, creating population concentrations that would prove particularly vulnerable to epidemic disease. Paris, with perhaps 200,000 inhabitants, ranked among Europe's largest cities, while London housed approximately 80,000 residents. Italian cities like Florence, Venice and Milan each supported populations exceeding 100,000. These urban centres depended entirely on complex supply chains that brought grain from distant rural areas and luxury goods from across the known world. Medieval cities presented ideal conditions for disease transmission. Houses crowded together along narrow, unpaved streets that served as open sewers. Most urban dwellers lived in multi-storey buildings with entire families occupying single rooms. Sanitation remained primitive. Human waste was typically thrown into the streets or nearby rivers, while animal refuse from horses, pigs and chickens accumulated in courtyards and alleys. Wells often became contaminated with sewage, and clean water remained a constant concern. The climate itself conspired against European populations during this period. The medieval warm period, which had enabled population growth and agricultural expansion from roughly 950 to 1250, was giving way to cooler, more unpredictable weather patterns that historians now call the Little Ice Age. This climatic transition manifested in shorter growing seasons, more frequent crop failures, and increased storm activity that disrupted both agriculture and maritime trade. Temperature reconstructions based on tree ring data, ice cores and historical records indicate that average temperatures began declining around 1300, with particularly severe cooling episodes in the 1310s and 1340s. The growing season in northern Europe shortened by several weeks compared to the previous century, forcing farmers to abandon marginal agricultural lands and concentrate on more reliable, lower altitude fields. Alpine glaciers advanced, destroying high-altitude settlements and pastures that had been cultivated during warmer periods. These climatic changes affected more than agriculture. Colder temperatures and increased storm activity made maritime trade more dangerous and unpredictable. Ships faced longer, more hazardous journeys, while port cities dealt with more frequent flooding and storm damage. The Baltic Sea froze more regularly, disrupting the lucrative trade in timber, furs and amber that connected northern and western Europe. Political instability compounded these environmental and demographic challenges. The 100 Years' War, which erupted in 1337 when Edward III of England claimed the French throne, would consume enormous resources and create massive population displacements over the following decades. The conflict's early phases saw English armies ravaging the French countryside, destroying crops, burning villages, and forcing peasants to flee their homes. The Battle of Crécy in 1346 demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of English longbowmen against French heavy cavalry, but the campaign that preceded it left a trail of destruction across northern France. Warfare in the 14th century involved more than pitched battles between armoured knights. Armies lived off the land through systematic plunder, a practice euphemistically called foraging. English chevauchés, mounted raids designed to destroy enemy resources, deliberately targeted agricultural infrastructure, burning mills, slaughtering livestock, and destroying stored grain. These tactics created refugee populations that crowded into fortified towns, straining urban resources and creating ideal conditions for disease transmission. The Holy Roman Empire faced its own succession crises following the death of Henry VII in 1313. The resulting power struggle between Louis IV of Bavaria and Frederick the Fair of Austria paralysed imperial authority and encouraged local conflicts throughout the German states. Italy remained fragmented among competing city-states, papal territories and foreign claimants. With warfare endemic throughout the peninsula, these political conflicts drained resources that might otherwise have been used to address economic and social problems. Military expenditures consumed enormous portions of royal revenues, forcing monarchs to debase their currencies and impose increasingly heavy taxes on already struggling populations. The English wool trade, which had provided crucial export revenues, faced disruption from continental warfare. French agricultural regions that had supplied grain to urban markets lay devastated by military campaigns. Monetary systems throughout Europe showed signs of strain as precious metal supplies failed to keep pace with economic growth. Silver mines in Bohemia and the German states, which had fueled economic expansion during the 12th and 13th centuries, showed declining output. The absence of significant gold deposits in Europe meant that monetary expansion depended on trade with North Africa and the Middle East, relationships that remained vulnerable to political and military disruption. Banking houses, particularly the great Italian firms like the Bardi and Peruzzi companies of Florence, had extended credit throughout Europe to finance everything from royal wars to agricultural improvements. These institutions faced increasing strain as borrowers, including the kings of England and France, struggled to service their debts. The interconnected nature of medieval banking meant that defaults in one region could trigger cascading failures throughout the European financial system. Social tensions accompanied these economic pressures. Urban artisans faced competition from rural craftsmen who had been driven from their villages by warfare or economic hardship. Guild systems that had regulated production and maintained social stability came under pressure as traditional hierarchies broke down. Peasant communities, already struggling with agricultural difficulties, faced increased demands for military service and taxation to fund ongoing conflicts. The Church, which had provided social stability and ideological coherence throughout the High Middle Ages, faced its own institutional crisis. The Avignon papacy, which had removed the papal court from Rome to southern France in 1309, created confusion about legitimate religious authority. This Babylonian captivity of the papacy coincided with increasing criticism of clerical corruption and growing challenges to traditional religious teachings. By the 1340s, European society resembled a structure under enormous stress, with multiple fault lines threatening its stability. Demographic pressure had pushed agricultural systems beyond their sustainable limits. Climate change was making food production increasingly unreliable. Political conflicts were draining resources and creating massive population displacements. Trade networks that brought prosperity also created pathways for disease transmission. Urban concentrations that represented the pinnacle of medieval civilization also provided ideal conditions for epidemic outbreaks. The stage was set for catastrophe, though few contemporary observers could have predicted the scale of the disaster that would soon engulf their world. The complex interactions between environmental stress, demographic pressure, political instability, an economic strain had created conditions of unprecedented vulnerability. When disease finally arrived from the east, it would find European populations uniquely susceptible to its devastating effects. While European society strained under the multiple pressures of famine, warfare, and climatic change, a microscopic killer was stirring to life thousands of miles away in the remote highlands of Central Asia. Deep within the burrow systems that honeycomb the Tian Shan mountains and the vast Mongolian steppes, colonies of marmots, ground squirrels, and other rodents harboured an ancient bacterium that had evolved alongside its hosts for millennia. This organism, later classified by scientists as Yersinia pestis, possessed the remarkable ability to manipulate both its mammalian hosts and the fleas that fed upon them, creating a transmission system of devastating efficiency. The bacterium itself measures barely 2 micrometers in length, appearing under microscopic examination as a small rod-shaped organism with rounded ends. Despite its diminutive size, Y. pestis represents one of nature's most sophisticated biological weapons. The organism produces a protein called plasminogen activator that prevents blood clotting in its victims, while simultaneously manufacturing toxins that destroy tissue and compromise immune system function. Most crucially for its transmission cycle, the bacterium produces a biofilm that blocks the digestive tract of infected fleas, forcing them to regurgitate contaminated blood back into their bite wounds. The natural reservoirs for this pathogen existed primarily among the burrowing rodent populations of the Central Asian highlands. Archaeological evidence from grave sites in the Tian Shan region reveals elevated mortality rates among human populations during the 1320s, suggesting that the disease had begun spilling over from its animal hosts into human communities. Chinese administrative records from the Yuan dynasty, though fragmented, document unusual patterns of death and abandonment in settlements along the Silk Road trade routes during this same period. The marmot populations of the Altai Mountains and surrounding regions had maintained stable and zootic cycles of plague for centuries, possibly millennia. These large ground squirrels, weighing up to 8 kilograms when fully grown, lived in extensive burrow networks that could house dozens of individuals. Their fleas, primarily Oropsilla silantiewi, had co-evolved with both the marmots and the plague bacterium, creating a balanced ecosystem where the disease persisted without causing catastrophic die-offs. Local human populations had learned to recognize the warning signs of plague epizootics among marmot colonies, the appearance of dead animals near burrow entrances, the sudden silence of normally chattering colonies, the desperate emergence of sick animals during daylight hours. The delicate balance of this system began shifting during the early decades of the 14th century. Climate reconstructions from ice cores and tree ring data indicate that the Central Asian steppes experienced significant environmental changes during the 1310s and 1320s. Temperature fluctuations and altered precipitation patterns disrupted the normal population dynamics of rodent communities. Some colonies experienced population booms that increased contact between infected and susceptible animals, while others faced environmental stress that weakened their resistance to disease. Chinese historical sources, particularly the Yuan Shi, provide fragmentary but compelling evidence of unusual mortality patterns during the 1320s and 1330s. Administrative records from provinces along the northern and western frontiers describe abandoned settlements, uncollected taxes, and requests for emergency grain supplies. The Gazetteer of Shaanxi Province mentions villages where 9 out of 10 households died during the winter of 1331 to 1332, while similar accounts emerge from Hebei and other northern regions. Archaeological investigations at sites along the ancient Silk Road have uncovered evidence supporting these historical accounts. Excavations at Karadzhigach in modern-day Kyrgyzstan revealed a cemetery where burial patterns changed dramatically during the 1330s. Instead of the typical scattered interments characteristic of normal mortality, Archaeologists found mass graves containing dozens of individuals buried simultaneously. Radiocarbon dating confirms that these burials occurred during the 1330s, while analysis of skeletal remains reveals evidence of rapid death among individuals of all ages, a pattern consistent with epidemic disease. The city of Isikkul, situated near the lake of the same name in present-day Kyrgyzstan, provides particularly compelling evidence of early plague outbreaks. Nestorian Christian tombstones from the local cemetery bear inscriptions dating to 1338 and 1339 that explicitly mention pestilence as the cause of death. One inscription, translated from Syriac, reads, "In the year 1649 of our Lord, 1338 AD, this is the tomb of Kutluk. He died of pestilence with his wife." Another tombstone from the same period states, "In the year 1650, 1339 AD, this is the tomb of the believer San Mac. He died of pestilence." The concentration of such inscriptions within a narrow time frame provides direct evidence that epidemic disease struck this Central Asian community nearly a decade before the plague reached European shores. The transformation of localized outbreaks into a pandemic required the involvement of human trade networks, particularly those maintained by the Mongol Empire and its successor states. By the 1320s, the unified Mongol Empire had fragmented into separate khanates, but the trade routes established during the previous century continued to function. The Yuan dynasty in China, though weakening under internal pressures and natural disasters, maintained commercial relationships with Central Asian territories under the control of the Chagatai Khanate and the Golden Horde. Mongol military campaigns and administrative movements provided crucial mechanisms for disease transmission across vast distances. Unlike European armies, which typically disbanded after brief campaigns, Mongol forces maintained permanent garrisons and conducted regular patrols across territories spanning thousands of kilometers. These military units included not only soldiers, but also camp followers, merchants, craftsmen, and herders with their livestock. The movement of such large, diverse groups created ideal conditions for pathogen transmission between different ecological zones. The decline of the Yuan dynasty during the 1330s and 1340s paradoxically accelerated disease transmission by creating massive population movements. Natural disasters, including floods along the Yellow River and droughts in northern China, combined with administrative breakdown to displace millions of people. Contemporary Chinese sources describe refugee populations moving along traditional trade routes, carrying their possessions and livestock as they sought safety in distant regions. These migrations brought together human populations from different areas, facilitating the exchange of pathogens that had previously remained geographically isolated. Military records from the Golden Horde, preserved in Persian and Arabic chronicles, describe unusual mortality among Mongol forces during campaigns in the 1340s. The historian Al-Makrizi, writing in Cairo, recorded accounts from Mongol merchants who described armies where soldiers died faster than they could be replaced during operations near the Black Sea. While these accounts lack the precision of modern epidemiological reports, they suggest that plague had begun affecting military units before the famous Siege of Caffa. The Siege of Caffa in 1346 represents a pivotal moment in plague transmission, though the exact details remain shrouded in conflicting accounts and later embellishments. Caffa, known today as Feodosia, occupied a strategic position on the Crimean Peninsula's southeastern coast. The city served as the primary Genoese trading post in the Black Sea region, with a permanent population of Italian merchants, Greek artisans, Armenian traders, and local Crimean inhabitants. Massive warehouses lined the harbour, storing grain from the Ukrainian steppes, furs from the Russian forests, and luxury goods from Central Asia and the Orient. The Golden Horde forces that besieged Caffa belonged to the army of Khan Janibeg, who had been conducting campaigns against Genoese and Venetian trading posts throughout the Black Sea region. These Mongol Tatar forces included not only traditional cavalry units, but also siege engineers, supply trains, and auxiliary troops drawn from various ethnic groups across the horde's territories. Many of these soldiers had recently participated in campaigns along the Silk Road trade routes, where they would have encountered plague-infected rodent populations and their human victims. Gabriele de Mussi, a notary from Piacenza, provided the most detailed contemporary account of the siege, though he wrote his chronicle several years after the events and likely relied on second-hand accounts from Genoese survivors. According to de Mussi, the besieging army began suffering from a mysterious disease that killed thousands of soldiers within days of onset. Victims developed painful swellings in their groins, armpits, and necks, followed by black patches on their skin and rapid death. The Mongol commanders, recognizing that their army was disintegrating, allegedly ordered the corpses of plague victims to be loaded into catapults and hurled over Caffa's walls. Archaeological evidence from Caffa itself remains limited, as the site has been continuously occupied and extensively modified over the centuries. However, excavations in the city's medieval quarter have uncovered mass burial sites that appear to date from the mid-14th century. Analysis of skeletal remains from these graves reveals evidence of rapid death among individuals of various ages, consistent with epidemic disease. More significantly, soil samples from these burial sites contain traces of Yersinia pestis DNA, providing scientific confirmation that plague reached Caffa during the 1340s. The alleged use of plague corpses as biological weapons represents one of history's first documented instances of biological warfare, though the effectiveness of this tactic remains debatable among modern historians and epidemiologists. Medieval catapults, designed primarily to hurl stone projectiles against fortifications, could certainly launch human corpses over city walls. However, the plague bacterium is relatively fragile and would likely not survive the trauma of catapult launch and impact. More importantly, the disease had probably already entered Caffa through infected rats and fleas aboard ships and caravans, making the deliberate introduction of corpses largely redundant. The siege's conclusion in late 1346 triggered the next phase of plague transmission. As Mongol forces withdrew, Genoese ships departed Caffa, carrying not only Italian merchants and their goods, but also the rats and fleas that had become infected during the siege. These vessels, their holds packed with grain and other commodities, provided ideal breeding grounds for rodent populations. Ship rats, primarily Rattus rattus, thrived in the warm, dark spaces between cargo containers, while their fleas maintained the plague transmission cycle throughout the journey. The first plague ship reached Constantinople in early 1347, where Byzantine chroniclers recorded the arrival of a Genoese galley whose crew had died during the voyage. Similar accounts describe plague-infected vessels reaching other Black Sea ports, including Trebizond and Sinope during the same period. From these initial footholds, the disease began spreading along established trade routes throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Venetian and Genoese trading records from 1347 provide detailed documentation of the plague's westward movement. Ship manifests from Venice describe vessels arriving from Constantinople and other eastern ports with significantly reduced crews, while port authorities in several Italian cities reported unusual mortality among sailors and dock workers. The interconnected nature of Mediterranean commerce ensured that infected ships reached multiple destinations simultaneously, creating numerous independent foci of plague transmission. The bacterium's journey from the remote burrows of Central Asian marmots to the bustling harbours of the Mediterranean represents one of history's most consequential biological invasions. Environmental changes in the steppes had disrupted ancient ecological balances, while human trade networks provided pathways for unprecedented long-distance pathogen transmission. The weakened state of European populations, already stressed by famine, warfare and climatic change, would soon encounter a disease against which they possessed no immunity and no effective treatments. By late 1347, plague had established footholds in multiple Mediterranean ports, poised to exploit the dense urban populations and extensive trade networks of medieval Europe. The stage was set for a pandemic that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of Western civilization. Though contemporary observers could scarcely comprehend the magnitude of the catastrophe that was about to unfold across their world. The autumn winds of 1347 carried more than the usual sense of salt spray and merchant cargo as they swept across the Mediterranean. On October 1st, 12 Genoese galleys limped into the harbour of Messina, their black hulls riding low in the choppy waters of the strait between Sicily and mainland Italy. The ships moved sluggishly, their crews visibly depleted, and the usual bustle of arrival, sailors securing lines, merchants preparing cargo manifests, dock workers gathering to unload valuable goods, gave way to an eerie silence as the vessels approached the stone quays. The harbour master of Messina, Giovanni de Venette, recorded in his ledger that the ships carried their usual cargo of Eastern luxuries, bolts of silk from Constantinople, sacks of precious spices from the Levant, and amphora filled with wine and oil. What he could not document was the invisible cargo that had travelled alongside these goods, infected black rats and their plague-carrying fleas, hidden deep within the holds where grain stores provided both food and breeding grounds. The rats themselves showed little sign of illness, but their fleas carried billions of Yersinia pestis bacteria in their block digestive systems, ready to transmit the pathogen with every desperate attempt to feed. Within hours of the ship's arrival, the first human cases appeared among the dock workers who had boarded the vessels to begin unloading operations. Michel da Piazza, a Franciscan friar who witnessed these initial infections, described men who had been healthy at dawn but were dead by sunset. The victims developed painful buboes, swollen lymph nodes the size of apples, in their groins, armpits and necks. Their skin took on a greyish pallor, marked by dark hemorrhagic spots that contemporary observers called God's tokens. Most died within 3 to 5 days of the first symptoms, though some succumbed within hours of falling ill. The Sicilian authorities initially attempted to contain the outbreak by prohibiting further contact with the Genoese ships, but their efforts proved futile. The rats had already dispersed throughout Messina's warehouses and residential districts, while infected fleas had begun seeking new hosts among the human population. The city's narrow streets, lined with multi-storey buildings where entire families occupied single rooms, provided ideal conditions for rapid transmission. Waste disposal systems that relied on open sewers and communal latrines created additional opportunities for pathogens spread through contaminated water sources. Messina's population of approximately 50,000 inhabitants faced a disease unlike anything in their collective memory. Local physicians, trained in the medical theories of Galen and Avicenna, attempted treatments based on the traditional understanding of disease as an imbalance of bodily humours. They prescribed bloodletting to reduce excess blood, administered purgatives to expel corrupted matter, and burned aromatic woods to purify the air. These interventions not only proved ineffective, but often weakened patients further, hastening their deaths. The plague's progression through Messina followed predictable patterns that would be repeated throughout Europe. Initial cases clustered around the harbour district, where dock workers, sailors and merchants had the most direct contact with infected ships. From there, the disease spread along the city's main thoroughfares, following the routes used by carts carrying goods from the port to markets and warehouses. Households with multiple generations living in close proximity experienced devastating mortality rates, with entire families dying within days of each other. Contemporary records from Messina's cathedral chapter describe the breakdown of normal social functions as the epidemic intensified. Priests refused to administer last rites to dying plague victims, while gravediggers abandoned their posts rather than handle infected corpses. The city's textile workshops, which employed hundreds of workers in cramped conditions, became death traps where the disease spread rapidly among labourers. By November 1347, Messina's mortality rate had reached levels that overwhelmed the city's capacity to bury its dead, forcing authorities to dig mass graves outside the city walls. The plague's arrival in Messina coincided with the busy autumn trading season, when merchants from across the Mediterranean converged on Sicilian ports to purchase grain harvests and winter supplies. Ships that had loaded cargo in Messina during October carried infected rats to ports throughout the region. A Pisan vessel that departed Messina on October 15th reached Genoa 12 days later, bringing the plague to one of Europe's most important commercial centres. Venetian galleys carried the disease to their home port, while smaller coastal traders spread the infection to dozens of minor harbours along the Italian peninsula. Genoa, with its population of approximately 100,000, represented a crucial node in Mediterranean trade networks. The city's merchants maintained commercial relationships extending from London to Constantinople, while its shipyards produced vessels that carried goods throughout the known world. When plague arrived in Genoese ships returning from Messina, it encountered a population already stressed by ongoing warfare with Venice and internal political conflicts between aristocratic factions. The disease's impact on Genoa proved particularly devastating because of the city's dependence on maritime commerce. Entire merchant families who lived in close proximity to their warehouses and shipping operations died within weeks of the plague's arrival. The Doria family, one of Genoa's most prominent trading dynasties, lost 17 members during November and December 1347. Similar mortality struck other merchant houses, disrupting commercial relationships that had taken generations to establish. Genoese chroniclers, including Giorgio Stella and Giovanni de Bazzano, provided detailed accounts of the plague's progression through their city. They described streets littered with corpses that remained unburied for days, while survivors fled to the surrounding countryside in desperate attempts to escape infection. The city's government, dominated by merchant oligarchs, initially attempted to maintain normal commercial operations, but the death toll among sailors and dock workers made such efforts impossible. Venice, Genoa's great rival, faced the plague's arrival with more systematic preparation. Venetian authorities had received reports of the disease's effects in other Mediterranean ports and attempted to implement protective measures before infected ships reached their lagoon. The city's unique geography, surrounded by water and accessible only through controlled channels, offered natural advantages for quarantine enforcement that other ports lacked. The Venetian response to plague represented the most sophisticated public health effort of the medieval period. City officials, led by the Provveditore alla Sanità, established inspection procedures for all incoming vessels. Ships arriving from infected ports faced mandatory waiting periods before crews and cargo could enter the city proper. These measures evolved into the first systematic quarantine system in European history, though the term quarantine itself derived from the Italian 40 giorni, reflecting the period that Venice eventually adopted as the standard isolation time. The 40-day quarantine period represented a compromise between commercial necessity and public health concerns. Venetian merchants could not afford to suspend trade indefinitely, but they recognized that unrestricted commerce would bring devastating mortality. The choice of 40 days reflected both practical considerations. Most plague victims died within a week of infection, making longer observation periods unnecessary, and religious symbolism, as 40 days held significance in Christian tradition, from the biblical flood to Christ's temptation in the wilderness. Venice established its first quarantine station on the island of Santa Maria di Nazareth, later known simply as Nazaretum or Lazaretto. Ships suspected of carrying plague were directed to anchor near this island, where their crews and passengers remained under observation, while their cargo was aired and fumigated. The facility included dormitories for travellers, warehouses for goods, and a chapel for religious services. Medical personnel, protected by leather clothing and masks filled with aromatic herbs, examined arrivals for signs of disease. The Venetian quarantine system faced immediate challenges from merchants who viewed the delays as unnecessary obstacles to profitable trade. Ship captains attempted to conceal deaths among their crews, while traders sought alternative routes that avoided Venice's restrictions. Some vessels diverted to smaller Adriatic ports where oversight was less stringent, inadvertently spreading plague to communities that lacked Venice's resources for disease control. Despite these limitations, Venice's quarantine measures achieved notable success in limiting plague mortality compared to other Italian cities. While Genoa and Pisa experienced death rates approaching 50% of their populations, Venice's mortality remained closer to 30%. The city's survival as a major commercial power, while many rivals suffered permanent decline, reflected the effectiveness of its early public health innovations. Florence, the jewel of Tuscany and centre of the Italian Renaissance, confronted the plague's arrival during the winter of 1347 to 1348. The city's population of approximately 120,000 made it one of Europe's largest urban centres, while its banking houses and textile industries had created unprecedented concentrations of wealth. Florentine merchants maintained commercial relationships throughout the Mediterranean and beyond, making the city a natural target for plague transmission. The disease reached Florence through multiple pathways simultaneously. Overland trade routes brought infected goods and travellers from Genoa and other northern ports, while ships arriving at Pisa carried the plague up the Arno River Valley. The city's dense population, concentrated within medieval walls that had become inadequate for its expanded size, created ideal conditions for rapid disease transmission. Giovanni Boccaccio, who witnessed the plague's devastation of Florence firsthand, provided one of the most vivid contemporary accounts of the epidemic's social impact. His introduction to the Decameron described a city where normal social bonds had dissolved under the pressure of mass mortality. Families abandoned sick relatives, while servants fled their employers' houses at the first sign of disease. The city's famous wool industry, which employed thousands of workers in crowded workshops, became a vector for plague transmission as infected workers spread the disease among their colleagues. Florence's medical establishment, considered among Europe's most advanced, proved helpless against the plague. The city's physicians, trained at the University of Bologna and other prestigious institutions, possessed detailed knowledge of classical medical texts, but lacked understanding of bacterial disease transmission. Their treatments, based on theories of miasmatic infection and humoral imbalance, not only failed to cure patients, but often accelerated their deaths through bloodletting and purgation that weakened already compromised immune systems. The plague's impact on Florence's banking industry created ripple effects throughout European commerce. The Bardi and Pruzzi companies, which had extended credit to monarchs and merchants across the continent, faced massive defaults as their partners died or fled. The Acciaiuoli Bank, which financed trade with the Eastern Mediterranean, lost key personnel and saw its commercial networks disrupted by plague-related mortality in partner cities. Rome, the eternal city and centre of Western Christianity, confronted the plague during the spring of 1348. The papal court's residence in Avignon meant that Rome lacked its traditional spiritual leadership during the crisis, while the city's dependence on pilgrimage revenue had created a transient population particularly vulnerable to epidemic disease. Pilgrims from across Europe converged on Rome's churches and shrines, inadvertently creating opportunities for plague transmission between different populations. The plague's arrival in Rome coincided with the Jubilee year preparations that Pope Clement VI had proclaimed from Avignon. Thousands of pilgrims had already arrived in the city, while thousands more were travelling toward Rome when news of the epidemic began spreading. The concentration of visitors in crowded hostels and religious institutions created ideal conditions for disease transmission, while the pilgrims' eventual return to their home regions would carry plague to communities throughout Europe. Roman chroniclers describe scenes of unprecedented mortality during the summer of 1348. The city's ancient catacombs, which had served as burial sites during the early Christian period, were reopened to accommodate the flood of plague victims. Traditional funeral rites became impossible as priests died alongside their parishioners, while the surviving clergy struggled to perform mass burials for hundreds of victims simultaneously. The plague spread throughout the Italian peninsula, followed predictable patterns based on commercial and political relationships. Cities connected by regular trade routes experienced nearly simultaneous outbreaks, while more isolated communities often escaped infection until travellers or refugees brought the disease from affected areas. Milan, protected by the authoritarian rule of the Visconti family, implemented strict quarantine measures that limited plague mortality compared to other northern Italian cities. The disease's transmission to southern France occurred through multiple maritime and overland routes. Marseille, France's primary Mediterranean port, received infected ships from Italian harbours during the winter of 1347 to 1348. The city's position as a gateway between the Mediterranean and the Rhone River Valley made it a natural distribution point for plague transmission into the French interior. From Marseille, infected travellers and goods moved northward along the Rhone, carrying plague to Lyon, Avignon, and eventually Paris. The papal court at Avignon faced the plague's arrival during the summer of 1348, creating a crisis that affected the entire structure of medieval Christianity. Pope Clement VI, recognizing the epidemic's supernatural appearance to contemporary observers, issued papal bulls granting special indulgences to plague victims and their families. The Pope's physician, Guy de Chauliac, provided detailed medical observations of the disease that became influential throughout Europe, though his treatments remained as ineffective as those prescribed by other medieval physicians. Spain's encounter with plague began along its Mediterranean coast during the spring of 1348. Barcelona, the principal port of the Crown of Aragon, received infected ships from Italian harbours while maintaining its own extensive trade networks throughout the western Mediterranean. The disease spread rapidly through the city's dense population, then moved inland along trade routes connecting Barcelona to Zaragoza and other interior cities. The plague's transmission to North Africa occurred through the same commercial networks that had brought prosperity to Mediterranean trading cities. Tunis, Alexandria, and other North African ports received infected ships from Italian and French harbours, while overland caravan routes carried the disease deeper into the African interior. The Mamluk Sultanate, which controlled Egypt and the Levant, faced devastating mortality that disrupted the spice trade and weakened Islamic resistance to future Christian crusading efforts. By the winter of 1347 to 1348, the plague had established multiple footholds across the Mediterranean basin, transforming from isolated outbreaks into a coordinated assault on European civilization. The disease's northward advance into France began along the Rhone River Valley, following the ancient Roman trade route that connected the Mediterranean port of Marseille to the interior of Gaul. Infected merchants, fleeing refugees, and contaminated cargo moved steadily upstream, carrying plague bacteria in the holds of river barges and the saddlebags of overland travellers. The city of Avignon, seat of the papal court since 1309, confronted the plague's arrival in March 1348, with a population swollen far beyond its medieval walls. The presence of Pope Clement VI and his extensive bureaucracy had attracted thousands of clerics, petitioners, merchants and craftsmen to what had once been a modest provincial town. The papal palace, still under construction, employed hundreds of workers from across Europe, while the city's narrow streets teemed with pilgrims seeking papal audiences and indulgences. Guy de Chauliac, the Pope's personal physician and one of medieval Europe's most accomplished medical practitioners, documented the plague's progression through Avignon with clinical precision that would prove invaluable to later historians. He observed that the disease manifested in two distinct forms, the bubonic variant, characterized by painful swellings in the lymph nodes, and a pneumonic form that attacked the lungs and proved invariably fatal within days of onset. The pneumonic plague, spread through respiratory droplets, moved with terrifying speed through Avignon's crowded religious institutions, killing entire monasteries within weeks. The papal court's international character accelerated plague transmission throughout Western Europe. Cardinals, bishops, and papal legates who had attended court sessions in Avignon returned to their home dioceses carrying infection to England, Germany, and the Low Countries. The extensive correspondence network that connected Avignon to churches throughout Christendom served as an inadvertent intelligence system, documenting the plague's spread as letters arrived from increasingly distant locations, reporting mass mortality among clergy and laity alike. Pope Clement VI himself remained in Avignon throughout the epidemic, refusing suggestions that he flee to safer locations. His physician prescribed an unusual regimen of isolation, requiring the Pope to remain between two constantly burning fires that supposedly purified the surrounding air. This accidental quarantine likely saved Clement's life, though he watched helplessly as his court disintegrated around him. The papal bureaucracy, which had grown into one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated administrative systems, lost hundreds of experienced clerks and notaries whose knowledge of canon law, diplomacy, and financial management could not be easily replaced. The plague's advance into the French interior followed the kingdom's river systems and major roadways with mechanical precision. Lyon, situated at the confluence of the Rhône and Saône rivers, served as a natural distribution point for disease transmission. The city's position on trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to northern France and the German states made it impossible to isolate, while its population of approximately 25,000 provided ample opportunities for human-to-human transmission. French royal chronicles describe the plague's arrival in Paris during the summer of 1348 as a catastrophe that dwarfed all previous disasters in the city's history. The capital's population of nearly 200,000 made it one of medieval Europe's largest urban centres, while its role as the seat of royal government attracted visitors from throughout the kingdom. The city's famous university, which had emerged as Europe's premier centre of theological and philosophical learning, lost hundreds of masters and students whose intellectual contributions represented centuries of accumulated knowledge. The mortality rates in Paris reached levels that challenged the city's capacity for normal social functioning. Contemporary estimates recorded by Jean de Venette and other chroniclers suggest that between 50,000 and 80,000 Parisians died during the plague's peak months of August and September 1348. The city's graveyards, already overcrowded from normal mortality, could not accommodate the flood of plague victims. Authorities opened new burial grounds outside the city walls, including the famous Cemetery of the Innocents, which became a mass grave holding thousands of plague victims. The French royal administration, centred in Paris, faced unprecedented challenges as the plague decimated the ranks of royal officials, judges, and financial administrators. King Philip VI, who had successfully defended his throne against English claims at the Battle of Crécy 2 years earlier, found his government paralysed by mortality among key personnel. The royal chancery, which produced hundreds of documents daily to govern the kingdom, lost scribes and notaries faster than they could be replaced. Tax collection, already complicated by ongoing warfare with England, became virtually impossible as royal agents died or fled their posts. The plague's impact on French agriculture proved equally devastating, though the full consequences would not become apparent until the following year's growing season. Rural communities throughout northern and central France experienced mortality rates that eliminated entire villages, leaving fields unharvested and livestock untended. The seigneurial system, which had organised French rural society for centuries, began breaking down as both lords and peasants succumbed to disease. Manor houses stood empty while their surrounding villages became ghost towns, populated only by scavenging animals and the occasional survivor. Bordeaux, the great wine-producing centre of southwestern France, faced the plague's arrival through its extensive maritime connections with both Mediterranean and Atlantic trading partners. The city served as the capital of English-controlled Gascony, making it a crucial link between England and the continental territories that English kings had inherited through marriage and conquest. Ships arriving from plague-infected Spanish and Italian ports brought the disease to Bordeaux's bustling harbour district during the late spring of 1348. The wine trade, which had made Bordeaux one of medieval Europe's wealthiest cities, provided ideal conditions for plague transmission. The city's numerous wine cellars and storage facilities harboured large populations of black rats, while the constant movement of barrels, carts and ships created opportunities for infected fleas to spread throughout the urban area. The seasonal nature of wine production meant that thousands of temporary workers had converged on Bordeaux for the 1348 harvest, creating population concentrations that facilitated rapid disease transmission. English merchants and officials in Bordeaux, recognising the plague's approach, attempted to flee back to England before the disease could reach them. However, their ships carried infected rats and cargo that would soon bring the plague across the English Channel. The interconnected nature of the Anglo-Gascon wine trade meant that English attempts to escape continental plague only succeeded in importing the disease to the British Isles. The plague's transmission to England occurred through multiple channels during the summer of 1348, though the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset recorded the first confirmed arrival of infected ships in June. A vessel carrying wool and wine from Gascon ports docked at Melcombe on June 24, 1348, bringing with it the rats and fleas that would introduce plague to the British Isles. The ship's crew showed signs of illness upon arrival, though port authorities initially attributed their condition to the hardships of maritime travel rather than epidemic disease. The English response to plague reports from the continent had been characterised by a mixture of disbelief and inadequate preparation. King Edward III, preoccupied with his ongoing campaigns in France, had received intelligence about continental plague outbreaks, but failed to implement systematic preventive measures. The English government's focus on military affairs meant that public health concerns received minimal attention, leaving English ports vulnerable to disease introduction. Melcombe Regis, despite its relatively small size, served as an important entry point for trade with France and the Iberian Peninsula. The town's location on the Dorset coast provided shelter for ships crossing the English Channel, while its markets attracted merchants from throughout southwestern England. The plague's introduction through this port ensured rapid transmission to the English interior, as infected goods and travellers dispersed along established trade routes. The disease spread from Melcombe to nearby Bristol within weeks, following the coastal trading routes that connected England's western ports. Bristol, with its population of approximately 20,000, ranked among England's largest cities after London. The city's merchants maintained extensive commercial relationships with Ireland, France, and the Iberian Peninsula, making it a natural distribution point for plague transmission throughout the British Isles. Bristol's experience with plague proved particularly devastating because of the city's role as a regional commercial centre. The disease struck during the busy summer trading season, when merchants from throughout western England converged on the city's markets and warehouses. The concentration of visitors from different regions created ideal conditions for spreading plague to communities that might otherwise have remained isolated from infection. The plague's advance through England followed predictable patterns based on population density and commercial connections. London, with its massive population of approximately 80,000, experienced catastrophic mortality when the disease arrived in September 1348. The city's role as England's political, economic, and religious centre meant that its suffering affected the entire kingdom's ability to function normally. Contemporary English chronicles, including those of Geoffrey Le Baker and Henry Knighton, described scenes of unprecedented mortality in London during the autumn and winter of 1348 to 1349. The city's numerous parishes competed for burial space as their graveyards filled beyond capacity. Westminster Abbey, the coronation church of English monarchs, lost more than half its monks, while the Tower of London, symbol of royal power, saw its garrison decimated by disease. The English government's attempts to maintain normal administrative functions proved largely futile as plague mortality eliminated key personnel at every level of royal service. The Royal Chancery, which had developed into one of medieval Europe's most efficient bureaucratic systems, lost experienced clerks and scribes whose knowledge of legal precedents and administrative procedures had taken decades to accumulate. Parliament, scheduled to meet in early 1349, had to be postponed indefinitely as nobles and representatives died or remained in their home regions to deal with local plague emergencies. The plague's transmission to Scotland occurred later than its arrival in England, partly due to the limited commercial connections between the two kingdoms, and partly because of ongoing warfare that had disrupted normal cross-border movement. Scottish forces, observing England's plague-induced weakness, attempted to launch raids into northern English territories during the winter of 1348 to 1349. However, these military expeditions inadvertently brought plague back to Scotland, where it spread rapidly through the Scottish lowlands and eventually reached Edinburgh and other major population centres. Ireland faced plague introduction through its commercial connections with both England and continental Europe. Ships arriving at Dublin, Cork and other Irish ports during the late summer and autumn of 1348 brought infected cargo and crew members who spread the disease throughout the island's English-controlled territories. The Anglo-Norman settlements, concentrated in Eastern Ireland, experienced mortality rates comparable to those in England, while Gaelic Irish communities in the island's interior initially remained largely unaffected. The plague's advance into the Holy Roman Empire began through multiple entry points along the empire's southern and western borders. Italian merchants crossing the Alpine passes brought infection to German trading cities, while ships ascending the Rhine River from the Low Countries carried plague to Cologne, Frankfurt and other major commercial centres. The empire's fragmented political structure, divided among hundreds of independent territories, made coordinated public health responses virtually impossible. Cologne, situated on the Rhine River and serving as one of Northern Europe's most important trading centres, confronted the plague's arrival during the autumn of 1348. The city's population of approximately 50,000 made it one of the empire's largest urban centres, while its position on trade routes connecting Italy, France and the Low Countries ensured regular contact with plague-infected regions. The city's famous cathedral, still under construction, employed hundreds of workers whose close quarters facilitated rapid disease transmission. The plague's impact on Cologne's commercial networks created ripple effects throughout northern Europe. The city served as a crucial link in the trade routes that carried goods between the Mediterranean and the Baltic Sea, while its merchants maintained commercial relationships extending from London to Novgorod. The disruption of these trading connections affected economic activity throughout the empire and beyond. Frankfurt, despite its smaller size, played an equally important role in imperial commerce through its position on trade routes connecting northern and southern Germany. The city's regular fairs attracted merchants from throughout Europe, creating temporary population concentrations that facilitated plague transmission. The disease's arrival during the autumn fair season of 1348 ensured its rapid spread to communities throughout the German states. Vienna, capital of the Austrian duchies and one of the empire's most important cities, faced plague introduction through its connections with Italian and Hungarian trading partners. The city's position on the Danube River made it a natural gateway between Western and Eastern Europe, while its role as a regional political centre attracted visitors from throughout the Habsburg territories. The plague's impact on Vienna disrupted the administration of the Austrian duchies and affected the empire's relationships with Hungary and other eastern neighbours. The disease's advance into Scandinavia occurred primarily through maritime connections with plague-infected ports in northern Germany and the Low Countries. Bergen, Norway's principal trading centre and a key node in the Hanseatic League's commercial network, received infected ships during the late summer of 1348. The city's role in the North Sea cod trade meant that its plague outbreak affected fishing communities throughout Norway and beyond. The plague's transmission to Sweden and Denmark followed similar patterns, with infected ships arriving at Stockholm, Copenhagen, and other Baltic ports during the autumn and winter of 1348 to 1349. The relatively sparse populations of Scandinavian countries meant that plague mortality, while severe in urban areas, had less dramatic effects on overall population levels compared to the more densely settled regions of France, England, and Italy. The disease's eastward advance into Poland, Hungary, and the territories of the Golden Horde occurred more slowly than its westward spread, partly due to less intensive commercial connections and partly because of geographic barriers that limited disease transmission. However, by 1349, plague had reached major Eastern European cities including Krakow, Buda, and eventually Novgorod, though Moscow's relative isolation and harsh climate provided some protection against the epidemic's most severe effects. The plague's arrival in each new region followed remarkably consistent patterns: initial introduction through commercial contacts, rapid spread in urban areas with high population density, devastating mortality among clergy and educated elites, breakdown of normal administrative and economic functions, and eventual transmission to surrounding rural areas through the movement of refugees and survivors. By the end of 1349, the disease had fundamentally altered the demographic, economic, and social landscape of medieval Europe, though its full consequences would take decades to become apparent. The first signs of plague infection typically appeared without warning, striking victims who had felt perfectly healthy just hours earlier. Contemporary physicians described a disease that began with sudden onset of high fever, accompanied by severe headaches that felt as though iron bands were tightening around the skull. Within 24 to 48 hours, the characteristic buboes began forming, painful, egg-sized swellings in the lymph nodes of the groin, armpits, or neck that gave bubonic plague its name. These buboes, described by the physician Guy de Chauliac as hard as stones and burning like fire, could grow to the size of apples and caused excruciating pain that made movement nearly impossible. The bubonic form, which accounted for approximately 80% of plague cases, followed a predictable progression that medieval physicians documented with increasing precision as the pandemic spread. After the initial fever and bubo formation, victims developed what contemporary sources called God's tokens, dark hemorrhagic spots that appeared on the skin as blood vessels ruptured under the bacterial toxins. These spots, ranging from deep purple to black, typically appeared on the chest and back before spreading to other parts of the body. The 14th century chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio described these marks as certain signs of impending death, noting that their appearance usually preceded death by no more than 3 days. Medieval medical treatises provide detailed descriptions of the plague's various manifestations. The Compendium de Epidemia, written by the medical faculty of the University of Paris in 1348, documented how bubonic plague victims experienced severe abdominal pain, vomiting of blood, and difficulty breathing as the disease progressed. Many patients developed delirium and spoke incoherently, while others fell into comas from which they never awakened. The treatise noted that approximately 60% of bubonic plague victims died, though those who survived the first week often recovered completely, apparently gaining lifelong immunity to the disease. The pneumonic variant proved far more deadly and terrifying to contemporary observers. This form attacked the respiratory system directly, causing victims to cough up blood-tinged sputum that contained millions of plague bacteria. The Venetian physician Marsilio Ficino described pneumonic plague victims as drowning in their own blood, noting that they typically died within 2 to 3 days of symptom onset, Unlike bubonic plague, the pneumonic form spread directly from person to person through respiratory droplets, making it impossible to avoid through isolation from rats and fleas. Pneumonic plague created scenes of horror in medieval hospitals and monasteries. The chronicler Jean de Venette described visiting the Hôtel Dieu in Paris, where pneumonic plague patients lay in rows, their laboured breathing creating a constant chorus of wheezing and gurgling sounds. The bloody sputum that victims coughed up stained bedding and floors, while the characteristic sweet, sickly odour of impending death filled entire wards. Hospital attendants, recognising the extreme contagiousness of pneumonic cases, often abandoned their posts rather than risk infection. The third variant, septicemic plague, occurred when bacteria entered the bloodstream directly without forming buboes. This form proved almost universally fatal, killing victims within hours of symptom onset. Contemporary physicians rarely had time to document septicemic cases thoroughly, as patients often died before medical attention could be summoned. The few recorded descriptions mentioned sudden collapse, high fever, and rapid development of the dark skin discoloration that gave this variant its medieval name of the Black Death. Medieval medical theory, dominated by the classical teachings of Galen and Hippocrates, attempted to explain plague within existing frameworks of disease causation. The miasma theory, which attributed disease to corrupted air or pestilential vapours, became the dominant explanation for plague transmission. Physicians believed that earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, or unusual planetary alignments had corrupted the atmosphere, creating poisonous air that caused disease in those who breathed it. This theory led to treatments focused on purifying the air through burning aromatic woods, herbs, and incense. The University of Paris Medical Faculty's official report on plague causation, commissioned by Pope Clement VI in 1348, represented medieval medicine's most sophisticated attempt to explain the pandemic. The report attributed the plague to a conjunction of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn that had occurred in 1345, which supposedly corrupted the air and created conditions favourable to disease. The physicians recommended avoiding corrupt air by staying indoors during certain hours, burning aromatic substances, and maintaining proper humoral balance through diet and bloodletting. Guy de Chauliac, perhaps the most accomplished surgeon of his era, provided the most detailed contemporary medical analysis of plague symptoms and treatments. His Chirurgia Magna, written partly during the plague years, described two distinct epidemic waves. The first characterised primarily by fever and pneumonic symptoms, the second dominated by bubonic manifestations. De Chauliac noted that the first wave proved more contagious and deadly, while the second allowed for occasional recoveries among patients who received prompt treatment. Medieval physicians prescribed treatments based on the theory of humoral imbalance, believing that plague resulted from an excess of corrupted blood and other bodily fluids. Bloodletting became the most common intervention, with physicians using lancets to open veins in the arms or applying leeches to draw blood from patients. The procedure, performed with unsanitized instruments in unsanitary conditions, likely hastened many deaths by weakening patients' immune systems and introducing secondary infections. Purgation represented another standard treatment, as physicians sought to expel corrupted matter from the digestive system. Patients received powerful laxatives made from herbs like senna and rhubarb, combined with emetics to induce vomiting. These treatments, designed to restore humoral balance, often caused severe dehydration and electrolyte imbalances that proved fatal to plague victims already weakened by bacterial infection. Surgical intervention focused primarily on treating buboes, which medieval physicians viewed as collections of corrupted blood and pus that needed to be drained. Surgeons used heated knives to lance buboes, attempting to release the evil humours within. While this procedure occasionally provided pain relief, it more often introduced secondary bacterial infections that killed patients who might otherwise have survived the initial plague infection. The lack of understanding about bacterial contamination meant that surgical instruments moved from patient to patient without cleaning, spreading infection throughout hospital wards. Herbal remedies proliferated as physicians and folk healers sought effective treatments for plague symptoms. Theriac, a complex compound containing dozens of ingredients including viper's flesh, was considered the most potent antidote to poison and disease. Wealthy patients paid enormous sums for authentic theriac, prepared according to ancient recipes, though the preparation's effectiveness remained purely psychological. Other popular remedies included powdered unicorn horn, crushed pearls, and various plant extracts that were believed to counteract the plague's toxic effects. The medical profession itself suffered catastrophic losses during the pandemic, undermining society's capacity to respond to the crisis. In Avignon, where Guy de Chauliac served as papal physician, all but one of the city's 18 physicians died during the plague's peak months. Similar mortality rates struck medical practitioners throughout Europe, as their close contact with infected patients exposed them to concentrated doses of plague bacteria. The University of Paris medical faculty lost more than half its members, while medical schools in Bologna, Montpellier, and other centres suspended operations due to faculty deaths. Hospitals, which had emerged during the 12th and 13th centuries as centres of medical care and charity, became death traps during the plague years. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris, Europe's largest hospital with more than 500 beds, recorded mortality rates exceeding 90% among plague patients. Hospital attendants, recognising the futility of treatment and fearing for their own lives, often abandoned their posts, leaving patients to die without care. The few hospitals that remained operational implemented primitive isolation procedures, separating plague victims from other patients, though they lacked understanding of proper infection control measures. Monastic infirmaries, which had provided medical care in rural areas, suffered even more devastating losses than secular hospitals. The close communal living arrangements in monasteries facilitated rapid plague transmission, while the religious obligation to care for the sick exposed monks and nuns to repeated infection. The Abbey of Saint-Denis near Paris lost 94 of its 150 monks, while similar mortality rates struck religious houses throughout Europe. The loss of monastic medical knowledge, accumulated over centuries of caring for the sick, represented an irreplaceable blow to medieval healthcare systems. Folk healers and wise women, who provided medical care to rural populations unable to afford university-trained physicians, developed their own responses to plague symptoms. These practitioners, working outside official medical theory, often achieved better results than their learned counterparts by focusing on symptom relief rather than theoretical treatments. Folk remedies included poultices applied to buboes, herbal teas to reduce fever, and various charms and prayers believed to provide spiritual protection against disease. The breakdown of medical institutions during the plague years forced communities to develop alternative approaches to healthcare. Barber surgeons, who normally provided minor surgical procedures and bloodletting services, found themselves thrust into roles as primary medical practitioners. These craftsmen, lacking formal medical education but possessing practical experience with wounds and infections, sometimes achieved better treatment outcomes than university-trained physicians whose interventions often proved counterproductive. Contemporary understanding of disease transmission remained fundamentally flawed, though some observers made remarkably accurate observations about plague's contagious nature. The Genoese notary Gabriele de Mussi noted that plague seemed to spread through contact with infected individuals or their possessions, leading him to recommend avoiding crowds and infected households. However, his explanation for this phenomenon relied on the miasma theory rather than understanding of bacterial transmission. Some medieval physicians recognized that plague exhibited patterns inconsistent with miasmatic disease transmission. The physician Ibn al-Khatib, working in Granada during the plague years, observed that plague spread along trade routes and affected households sequentially, rather than striking entire communities simultaneously, as would be expected from corrupted air. His treatise on the plague argued for contagion through direct contact, though his theories remained outside mainstream medical thinking. The role of rats and fleas in plague transmission remained completely unknown to medieval observers, though some chroniclers noted unusual animal behaviour preceding human outbreaks. The Chronicle of Neuburg described masses of dead rats appearing in German cities shortly before plague arrived, while Italian sources mentioned unusual flea infestations during plague seasons. However, these observations were typically interpreted as omens or supernatural signs rather than epidemiological clues. Modern understanding reveals that medieval physicians faced an impossible task in treating plague without knowledge of bacterial pathogenesis or effective antibiotics. Yersinia pestis produces toxins that cause the massive tissue damage and circulatory collapse that killed plague victims. While the bacterium's ability to resist phagocytosis by immune cells made recovery difficult even for healthy individuals. The bloodletting and purgation that formed the basis of medieval treatment actually weakened patients' immune responses, making death more likely. The medieval medical response to plague represented both the limitations and achievements of 14th century healthcare systems. While treatments proved ineffective and often harmful, the detailed clinical observations recorded by physicians like Guy de Chauliac provided valuable documentation of plague symptoms and progression. The quarantine measures developed in Venice and other Italian cities, though based on flawed understanding of disease transmission, established principles of epidemic control that would evolve into modern public health practices. The plague's devastation of medical institutions forced innovation in healthcare delivery and create opportunities for new approaches to disease treatment that would influence medical practice for centuries to come. The carefully constructed social order that had governed medieval Europe for centuries began disintegrating within weeks of the plague's arrival in any given community. The disease struck with such speed and lethality that traditional institutions simply could not adapt quickly enough to maintain their normal functions. In Paris, where royal authority had seemed unshakable just months earlier, the machinery of government ground to a halt as clerks, judges and administrators died faster than replacements could be trained. The Parliament of Paris, the kingdom's highest court, suspended sessions indefinitely when 7 of its 12 presidents succumbed to plague during a single week in August 1348. The breakdown manifested most visibly in the collapse of burial practices that had remained unchanged for generations. Christian tradition demanded individual graves blessed by priests, with bodies wrapped in shrouds and laid to rest in consecrated ground. These customs reflected deep theological beliefs about bodily resurrection and the soul's journey to the afterlife. However, when daily death tolls in major cities reached hundreds or even thousands, such elaborate procedures became physically impossible. London's graveyards, already overcrowded before the plague's arrival, overflowed completely by October 1348. The Bishop of London, Ralph Stratford, authorised the opening of new burial grounds outside the city walls, but even these emergency measures proved inadequate. Contemporary chroniclers described the horror of mass graves that violated every principle of Christian burial. In Avignon, where the papal court witnessed the epidemic's devastation firsthand, bodies were stacked in layers separated only by thin coverings of lime and dirt. The Chronicle of Jean de Venette recorded that Parisian authorities eventually resorted to digging enormous pits that could accommodate hundreds of corpses simultaneously. Workers threw bodies into these trenches without shrouds or coffins, often while relatives watched helplessly from a distance. The sight of naked corpses piled like cordwood traumatized survivors and reinforced their sense that the natural order had been fundamentally disrupted. The shortage of clergy created additional complications for burial procedures. Priests, who lived in close contact with dying parishioners and administered last rites to plague victims, experienced mortality rates even higher than the general population. The Diocese of Winchester lost 49% of its parish priests during the plague years, while some rural areas saw every cleric die within months of the disease's arrival. Without priests to perform funeral masses and bless graves, many communities abandoned religious burial entirely. Families buried their dead in gardens, fields, or wherever ground could be broken, often marking graves with simple wooden crosses or piles of stones. Law enforcement collapsed with equal dramatic effect as constables, bailiffs, and court officials died or fled their posts. The intricate system of manorial courts that had governed rural England for centuries ceased functioning when both lords and their administrative staff succumbed to plague. Legal disputes that would normally have been resolved through established procedures remained unaddressed for months or years. Property ownership became increasingly unclear as entire families died without leaving clear heirs, while contracts and agreements lost meaning when the parties involved had perished. Urban areas faced particular challenges as their more complex legal systems required larger numbers of trained personnel. Florence's sophisticated commercial courts, which had developed elaborate procedures for resolving disputes between merchants and craft guilds, suspended operations when the plague killed most of their judges and legal clerks. The city's famous notaries, who maintained the detailed records that supported Florentine commerce, died in such numbers that business transactions became nearly impossible to document properly. Contracts worth thousands of florins became worthless pieces of parchment when the notaries who had witnessed their creation were no longer alive to verify their authenticity. The absence of effective law enforcement created opportunities for criminal activity that further destabilized plague-stricken communities. Bands of thieves and brigands, often composed of survivors who had lost their normal means of livelihood, roamed the countryside, looting abandoned houses and attacking vulnerable travellers. The English chronicler Henry Knighton described gangs of criminals who specifically targeted plague-emptied villages, stripping them of anything valuable before moving on to the next settlement. These groups operated with virtual impunity, as the few surviving officials lacked the manpower to pursue them effectively. Some of these criminal bands evolved into more organised military units that challenged local authority directly. In France, where royal power had already been weakened by military defeats against England, groups calling themselves routiers or écorcheurs established themselves in abandoned castles and demanded tribute from surrounding communities. These bands typically consisted of former soldiers who had been discharged when their lords died of plague, combined with displaced peasants and urban refugees who had turned to violence as a means of survival. They possessed military training and equipment that made them formidable opponents for the weakened forces that legitimate authorities could muster. The city of Strasbourg experienced one of the most dramatic examples of social breakdown when its municipal government simply ceased to exist during the winter of 1348 to 1349. The plague had killed the mayor, most of the city council, and the majority of guild leaders who normally participated in urban governance. Without recognised leadership, different factions within the city began competing for control, leading to armed conflicts in the streets. Various neighbourhoods organised their own defence forces, creating a patchwork of mini-territories within what had once been a unified urban community. Religious institutions, which had provided stability and spiritual comfort for centuries, found themselves facing unprecedented challenges to their authority and relevance. The Church's inability to protect believers from plague or provide effective spiritual remedies led many to question fundamental theological assumptions. If God truly protected the righteous and punished the wicked, why did the plague kill virtuous priests alongside notorious sinners? Why did prayer, fasting, and other traditional spiritual practices prove powerless against the disease? These questions, whispered at first, gradually became open challenges to clerical authority. The Flagellant movement emerged as one of the most visible responses to this religious crisis. These groups, composed primarily of lay people who believed that extreme physical penance could appease God's wrath, first appeared in Germanic territories during the autumn of 1348. flagellant processions typically included several dozen participants who marched from town to town, stripping to the waist and whipping themselves with leather scourges embedded with metal spikes. They performed these rituals in public squares while chanting hymns and calling upon God to end the plague in exchange for their suffering. The flagellant movement spread rapidly across northern Europe, attracting participants from all social classes. Nobles abandoned their estates to join processions, while merchants closed their shops to participate in public penance. The movement's appeal lay partly in its promise of direct access to divine mercy without clerical mediation. Flagellant leaders claimed that their extreme devotion could accomplish what traditional church rituals had failed to achieve. They established their own liturgies and sacraments, effectively creating an alternative religious structure that bypassed established ecclesiastical authority. Pope Clement VI initially tolerated the flagellant movement, recognizing that it channeled popular religious energy in ways that might support rather than challenge church authority. However, as flagellant groups became increasingly independent and their leaders began claiming special spiritual powers, the papal court grew concerned about their orthodoxy. The movement's emphasis on lay religious authority threatened the clerical monopoly on sacramental functions that form the foundation of church power. By 1349, papal bulls began condemning flagellant excesses while attempting to bring the movement under official ecclesiastical control. Pilgrimage activity increased dramatically during the plague years as believers sought divine intervention through visits to holy shrines and relics. The roads leading to Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury and Rome filled with pilgrims who hoped that demonstrating their faith through arduous journeys might protect them from disease or secure divine forgiveness for sins that had supposedly brought the plague upon Christendom. These mass movements of people inadvertently accelerated plague transmission as infected pilgrims carried the disease to previously unaffected regions. The shrine of Our Lady of Rocamadour in southern France experienced unprecedented crowds during 1348 and 1349, as pilgrims from across Europe converged on the site seeking miraculous healing. Contemporary accounts describe processions of thousands of pilgrims, many carrying plague victims on stretchers in hope of divine cure. The concentration of sick and healthy pilgrims in close quarters created ideal conditions for disease transmission, transforming religious sanctuaries into plague distribution centres. Similar patterns occurred at other major pilgrimage sites throughout Europe, as religious devotion paradoxically accelerated the very epidemic that pilgrims sought to escape. The Avignon papacy faced particular challenges during the plague years, as its legitimacy had already been questioned by those who believed the papal court belonged in Rome rather than southern France. The plague's arrival in Avignon during 1348 seemed to confirm divine displeasure with the papal court's location, providing ammunition for critics who argued that God was punishing the church for abandoning its traditional seat. Pope Clement VI's survival, while thousands died around him, led to conflicting interpretations. Some saw it as evidence of divine protection, while others suggested that the Pope's isolation from his suffering flock demonstrated spiritual inadequacy. The papal administration struggled to maintain its extensive bureaucratic functions, as plague mortality eliminated experienced personnel throughout the ecclesiastical hierarchy. The College of Cardinals lost 6 members during 1348, while the papal chancery saw its staff reduced by more than half. The complex system of papal taxation that funded church operations throughout Europe broke down as local collectors died or abandoned their posts. Benefices remained vacant for months because the officials responsible for appointments had perished, while ecclesiastical courts suspended operations due to lack of qualified personnel. Local church hierarchies faced even more severe disruption. The Archbishopric of Canterbury lost 4 successive archbishops to plague between 1348 and 1349, creating a crisis of leadership that affected the entire English church. Parish priests, who provided the most direct contact between church and people, died in such numbers that many communities went without religious services for months. The Diocese of Norwich recorded that 742 of its priests died during the plague years, representing nearly 60% of the total clergy. Rural parishes were particularly affected, as isolated priests had no colleagues to share the burden of caring for plague victims. The shortage of clergy forced the church to relax traditional requirements for ordination and service. Men who would normally have required years of theological training were ordained after abbreviated preparation, while lay people assumed responsibilities previously reserved for priests. Women, though still excluded from formal ordination, took on expanded roles in caring for the sick and maintaining religious observances in communities where all male clergy had died. These practical adaptations challenged traditional gender hierarchies and created precedents for lay religious authority that would influence church development for generations. The plague's demographic impact fundamentally altered marriage patterns and family structures throughout Europe. The massive mortality created unprecedented numbers of widows and orphans who required new social arrangements for survival. Traditional marriage customs, which had emphasized careful negotiations between families regarding property transfers and social alliances, gave way to more pragmatic unions based on immediate economic necessity. Widows who would normally have remained unmarried or entered religious houses instead sought new husbands who could manage their inherited properties and provide protection for their children. The shortage of marriageable men in many communities led to significant changes in courtship and marriage customs. Women who had previously possessed limited choices in selecting spouses found themselves in positions of relative strength, able to negotiate more favourable marriage terms. Some widows accumulated substantial properties through multiple marriages as successive husbands died of plague, creating a new class of wealthy women whose economic independence challenged traditional gender hierarchies. Inheritance laws, which had developed over centuries to regulate property transfers between generations, faced unprecedented challenges as entire family lines disappeared. The English legal system, based on primogeniture and careful documentation of bloodlines, broke down when heirs could not be located or verified. Manorial records, which had tracked land holdings and obligations for generations, became meaningless when both lords and tenants had died without clear successors. Royal courts faced thousands of disputed inheritance cases that overwhelmed their capacity for resolution. The disruption of traditional inheritance patterns created opportunities for social mobility that had been virtually impossible under normal circumstances. Peasants who survived plague outbreaks sometimes found themselves inheriting lands and properties that elevated them to positions of local prominence. Urban craftsmen whose masters had died gained access to guild memberships and established businesses that would normally have required decades of gradual advancement. These rapid social changes challenged the rigid hierarchies that had characterized medieval society and created new forms of social organization based on survival rather than birth. The economic catastrophe that followed the Black Death's demographic devastation manifested first in the countryside, where abandoned fields stretched across the European landscape like open wounds in the agricultural system. In England's Midlands, entire villages stood empty by the spring of 1349, their thatched roofs beginning to sag and their carefully maintained field boundaries already blurring as weeds reclaimed cultivated land. The manor of Tusmoy in Oxfordshire, which had supported 42 households before the plague, recorded only 3 surviving families by 1350. Similar scenes repeated across thousands of rural settlements from Scotland to Sicily, as mortality rates exceeding 50% in many areas left insufficient survivors to maintain traditional farming operations. The immediate agricultural crisis extended beyond simple population loss to encompass the complete breakdown of seasonal farming cycles that had sustained European civilization for centuries. The autumn ploughing of 1348 essential for preparing fields for winter wheat and rye, went largely unfinished across plague-stricken regions. Surviving peasants, weakened by disease and grief, lacked the physical strength to manage the heavy teams of oxen required for deep ploughing. More critically, the draft animals themselves had often died or scattered when their owners perished, leaving fields that could only be worked by hand, an impossibly labour-intensive task for the reduced population. Spring sowing in 1349 presented even greater challenges as seed grain, normally preserved from the previous harvest, had been consumed during the winter by desperate survivors or had rotted in abandoned granaries. The manor rolls of Haleswyn in Worcestershire recorded that less than 30% of the domain land received proper spring sowing, while tenant holdings fared even worse. Those seeds that were planted often went untended, as the surviving population focused on immediate survival rather than long-term agricultural planning. The resulting harvest failures created food shortages that persisted for years after the plague's initial passage. Livestock populations suffered catastrophic losses that extended far beyond direct plague mortality. Cattle, sheep, and pigs that had provided essential protein, wool, and leather for medieval communities died of starvation when their human caretakers perished. The pipe rolls of Durham Cathedral Priory documented the loss of nearly 2/3 of the monastery's sheep flocks, not from disease, but from abandonment and predation. Wild animals, freed from human control, devastated remaining livestock populations, while former pastures reverted to wilderness. The economic value of these lost animals, representing decades of careful breeding and husbandry, could not be easily replaced even when human populations eventually recovered. The collapse of craft production in urban areas proved equally devastating to Europe's economic infrastructure. Florence's renowned textile industry, which had employed thousands of workers in spinning, weaving, dyeing and finishing operations, virtually ceased production during the plague months of 1348. The closely packed workshops where artisans had laboured side by side became death traps where disease spread with terrifying efficiency. Master craftsmen who had spent decades perfecting their skills died alongside their apprentices, taking irreplaceable technical knowledge to their graves. The guild records of the Arte di Lana documented the deaths of 847 wool workers during the plague's peak, representing nearly 60% of the industry's skilled workforce. The disruption of craft production created cascading effects throughout European commercial networks. Italian silk production, concentrated in cities like Lucca and Florence, ground to a halt when master weavers and their trained assistants died within weeks of each other. The complex techniques required to produce the finest silk fabrics, passed down through generations of craftsmen, disappeared entirely from some regions. Lucca's silk industry, which had supplied luxury textiles to courts throughout Europe, took decades to recover even a fraction of its pre-plague capacity. The city's guild records reveal desperate attempts to recruit foreign craftsmen to replace the dead, offering unprecedented wages and privileges to attract skilled workers from other regions. Metalworking industries faced similar devastation as smiths, armourers, and specialised craftsmen succumbed to plague in their crowded workshops. The production of agricultural tools, essential for maintaining farming operations, declined precipitously when village blacksmiths died without trained successors. Rural communities that had relied on local smiths for repairing ploughs, sharpening scythes, and shoeing horses found themselves unable to maintain basic agricultural equipment. The manor of Cuxham in Oxfordshire recorded that its ploughshares went unrepaired for 3 consecutive seasons, because no qualified smith could be found within a day's journey. Long-distance trade networks, which had connected European markets to suppliers in Asia and North Africa, experienced systematic collapse as merchant houses lost key personnel and trading relationships. The Medici Bank's correspondence files reveal the death of 17 of their 23 foreign agents during 1348 to 1349, effectively ending their commercial operations in England, France, and the Low Countries. Venetian galleys that had regularly sailed to Constantinople and Alexandria found their traditional trading partners dead or fled, while the complex credit arrangements that had financed international commerce became meaningless when the merchants involved had perished. The disruption of maritime trade proved particularly severe in the Mediterranean, where plague had first entered Europe through infected ships. Genoa's merchant fleet, which had dominated trade routes to the Black Sea and eastern Mediterranean, lost nearly half its experienced captains and navigators to plague. The specialised knowledge required for long-distance navigation, including familiarity with seasonal weather patterns, safe harbours, and local trading customs, died with these mariners. Younger sailors lacked the experience to maintain established trade routes, while the financial resources necessary to outfit trading expeditions had been depleted by plague-related losses. The Hanseatic League, which had coordinated trade throughout northern Europe and the Baltic region, faced severe disruption as key member cities lost the merchant families who had maintained commercial relationships for generations. Lübeck's council records document the deaths of 43 of the city's 67 merchant families during the plague years, effectively destroying the personal networks that had facilitated trade from Novgorod to London. Bergen's crucial role in the North Sea fish trade collapsed when the plague killed most of the German merchants who'd organised the seasonal cod fisheries. The disruption of these trading relationships created food shortages throughout northern Europe, as communities that had depended on imported fish faced protein deficits that persisted for years. The emergence of acute labour shortages in the plague's aftermath fundamentally altered the balance of power between employers and workers throughout Europe. Surviving peasants who had previously possessed limited bargaining power due to population pressure on available land suddenly found themselves in positions of unprecedented strength. Landlords who had routinely extracted heavy labour services from their tenants now competed desperately for the reduced workforce, offering wages and working conditions that would have been unimaginable before the demographic catastrophe. The transformation manifested most dramatically in agricultural wages, which increased by 200 to 300% in many regions during the immediate post-plague period. The manor rolls of Ramsey Abbey in Huntingdonshire recorded daily wages for harvest workers rising from 4p before the plague to 12p by 1350, while similar increases occurred throughout England's agricultural regions. These wage increases reflected not merely temporary scarcity, but a fundamental shift in the relationship between labour supply and demand that would reshape European society for generations. Rural workers began demanding not only higher wages, but also improved working conditions and greater personal freedom. Peasants who had previously been bound to their lord's land through customary obligations started abandoning their holdings to seek better opportunities elsewhere. The legal restrictions that had prevented such movement, enforced through manorial courts and royal legislation, became unenforceable when the administrative apparatus responsible for their implementation had been decimated by plague mortality. Village reeves, bailiffs, and other local officials who had traditionally monitored peasant movement were often among the plague's victims, leaving survivors free to pursue economic opportunities wherever they could find them. The shortage of agricultural workers forced fundamental changes in farming practices that had remained stable for centuries. The three-field system, which had required intensive labour for ploughing, sowing, weeding and harvesting, became impractical when villages could muster only a fraction of their former workforce. Landlords began consolidating scattered holdings into larger, more efficient units that could be worked by smaller numbers of labourers. The process of enclosure, which would eventually transform the English countryside, began during the post-plague period as landowners sought to adapt their estates to the new demographic realities. The shift from labour service to money rents represented one of the most significant changes in medieval agricultural organisation. Before the plague, most peasants had owed their lords specific amounts of work, typically 2 or 3 days per week during busy seasons, in exchange for the right to farm their holdings. The shortage of workers made such arrangements impractical, as lords could not compel sufficient labour from their reduced tenant populations. Instead, they began accepting cash payments in lieu of work obligations, allowing peasants to focus their efforts on their own holdings, while providing lords with money that could be used to hire wage labourers when available. This transformation from service to cash relationships fundamentally altered the nature of rural society. Peasants who paid money rents rather than performing labour service gained greater autonomy over their time and agricultural decisions. They could choose which crops to plant, when to harvest, and how to organise their work without interference from manorial officials. This increased independence encouraged innovation and efficiency improvements that had been discouraged under the traditional system of close supervision and customary practices. The consolidation of agricultural holdings accelerated as surviving peasants accumulated the lands of plague victims who had died without heirs. In many villages, a few families acquired substantial holdings that elevated them from subsistence farming to commercial agriculture. The 100 rolls for the village of Holywell-cum-Needingworth in Huntingdonshire show that 5 families controlled nearly 60% of the village's arable land by 1355, compared to a much more even distribution before the plague. These successful peasants began operating more like small-scale landlords, hiring wage labourers and investing in improved agricultural techniques. Urban labour markets experienced even more dramatic transformations as craft guilds struggled to maintain their traditional control over production and employment. The guild system, which had regulated urban economic life for centuries through strict apprenticeship requirements and production quotas, faced collapse when master craftsmen died faster than they could train replacements. Surviving workers found themselves in positions to demand guild membership and master status that would normally have required decades of gradual advancement. The records of London's various craft guilds show hundreds of emergency admissions during 1349 to 1350, as organisations that had previously restricted membership to maintain artificial scarcity were forced to accept any qualified workers they could find. The breakdown of guild restrictions created opportunities for economic innovation that had been suppressed under the traditional system. Craftsmen who had been limited to specific techniques and materials by guild regulations began experimenting with new methods of production. The textile industry in particular saw rapid adoption of labour-saving techniques as producers sought to maintain output with reduced workforces. Water-powered fulling mills, which had been opposed by cloth workers who feared unemployment, gained acceptance as the shortage of workers made mechanisation economically attractive. Women's participation in craft production increased dramatically as traditional gender restrictions became impractical in the face of labour shortages. Guild records from Paris, London, and other major cities document women taking over businesses previously operated by their deceased husbands, often continuing production with female workers who had been excluded from formal guild membership. The brewing industry, which had traditionally employed women in subordinate roles, saw female brewers establishing independent operations that competed directly with male-dominated guild enterprises. The emergence of new merchant classes reflected the opportunities created by the disruption of established commercial relationships. Survivors who possessed even modest amounts of capital could establish trading operations in markets previously dominated by established merchant families. The death of traditional commercial elites created vacuums that enterprising individuals could fill, often achieving rapid advancement that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Italian cities that had been dominated by ancient merchant dynasties saw new families rise to prominence through aggressive exploitation of post-plague economic opportunities. The transformation of manufacturing processes accelerated as producers sought to maintain output with reduced workforces. The adoption of water-powered machinery, which had proceeded slowly before the plague due to opposition from craft workers, gained momentum as labour shortages made mechanisation essential for economic survival. Mills, for grinding grain, fulling cloth, and processing raw materials proliferated throughout Europe as entrepreneurs invested in labour-saving technologies. The initial capital requirements for such investments favoured those who had accumulated resources during the immediate post-plague period, contributing to growing economic inequality between successful survivors and those who remained dependent on wage labour. Regional variations in economic recovery reflected differences in pre-plague economic structures and plague mortality rates. Areas with diversified economies that combined agriculture, craft production, and trade proved more resilient than regions dependent on single industries. The Low Countries, with their mixture of urban manufacturing and intensive agriculture, recovered more quickly than purely agricultural regions like parts of rural France and England. Italian city-states that had maintained commercial relationships with multiple trading partners could adapt to the loss of specific markets more easily than communities dependent on single economic relationships. The demographic catastrophe created by the Black Death had fundamentally altered the economic foundations of medieval European society. The acute labour shortages that followed the plague's passage shifted bargaining power from employers to workers, forcing changes in agricultural practices, manufacturing techniques, and commercial relationships that would have been unthinkable under normal demographic conditions. These transformations represented not merely temporary adjustments to crisis, but the beginning of long-term structural changes that would reshape European economic development for centuries to come. The profound trauma inflicted by the Black Death penetrated far beyond the immediate physical devastation, seeping into the collective consciousness of medieval Europe and fundamentally transforming how people understood life, death, and their place in the cosmic order. This psychological upheaval manifested most powerfully in the cultural and artistic expressions that emerged during and immediately after the pandemic, creating entirely new genres of literature, revolutionary artistic movements, and architectural innovations that would define European culture for centuries to come. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, completed around 1353, stands as perhaps the most significant literary response to the plague experience, though its influence extends far beyond mere documentation of the epidemic's social effects. Boccaccio structured his masterwork around the framework of 10 young Florentines, 7 women and 3 men, who flee their plague-ravaged city to spend 10 days in a countryside villa, entertaining themselves by telling stories. This narrative device allowed Boccaccio to explore the complete spectrum of human behaviour under extreme duress, while creating a literary form that would influence storytelling traditions throughout Europe. The frame narrative of the Decameron provided Boccaccio with opportunities to document the plague's impact on Florentine society, with unprecedented detail and psychological insight. His description of Florence during the epidemic's peak captured not merely the physical horror of mass mortality, but the complete breakdown of social conventions that had governed medieval urban life. Boccaccio observed how traditional moral restraints dissolved when death became so commonplace that survival took precedence over social propriety. His characters engage in behaviours, from sexual liaisons to elaborate deceptions, that would have been scandalous under normal circumstances but seem natural responses to a world where conventional rules had lost their meaning. The individual tales within the Decameron reflected the plague's psychological impact through their emphasis on fortune, chance, and the unpredictability of human fate. Unlike earlier medieval literature, which typically reinforced divine providence and moral order, Boccaccio's stories celebrated human ingenuity, adaptability, and the pursuit of pleasure in the face of uncertain mortality. The merchant Federigo, who bankrupts himself pursuing an unattainable woman only to win her love through an act of desperate generosity, exemplified the kind of dramatic reversals that plague survivors had witnessed in their own lives. These narratives resonated with readers who had seen entire social hierarchies overturned within months of the epidemic's arrival. Boccaccio's linguistic innovations proved equally influential in shaping post-plague literary culture. Writing in vernacular Italian rather than Latin, he demonstrated that serious literature could address contemporary social realities in language accessible to the emerging merchant classes who had survived the demographic catastrophe. His prose style, characterized by complex sentence structures that mirrored the intricacies of human psychology, provided a model for later writers seeking to capture the emotional complexity of post-plague European society. The Decameron's success encouraged vernacular literature throughout Europe, contributing to the development of national literary traditions that would eventually eclipse Latin as the primary medium for serious writing. Geoffrey Chaucer's engagement with plague themes in the Cysylltau. The Canterbury Tales demonstrated how the pandemic's psychological impact influenced even works not explicitly concerned with epidemic disease. Chaucer's pilgrims, travelling to Thomas Becket's shrine at Canterbury, represented the kind of religious journey that had become increasingly common as plague survivors sought spiritual meaning in their survival. The diverse social backgrounds of the pilgrims, from the aristocratic knight to the working-class miller, reflected the social mobility that plague mortality had created throughout English society. The Pardoner's Tale, with its famous moral that greed is the root of all evil, addressed anxieties about moral corruption that had accompanied the economic opportunities created by massive population loss. The story's three protagonists, who set out to find death personified but instead find treasure that leads to their mutual destruction, embodied the psychological tensions experienced by plague survivors who'd accumulated wealth through inheritance or economic opportunism. Chaucer's treatment of this theme reflected widespread concerns about whether prosperity gained through others' misfortune carried moral consequences that might invite divine retribution. The Wife of Bath's character and tale illustrated how the plague had altered gender relationships throughout medieval society. Her multiple marriages, accumulated wealth, and assertive personality reflected the real experiences of women who had gained unprecedented independence through widowhood and inheritance. The wife's argument for female sovereignty in marriage challenged traditional gender hierarchies that had been weakened by the demographic disruptions following the plague. Her tale, in which a knight must discover what women most desire, provided a framework for exploring how relationships between men and women had been fundamentally altered by the social transformations of the post-plague period. The emergence of plague literature as a distinct genre extended far beyond these canonical works to encompass hundreds of shorter pieces that documented local experiences of epidemic disease. Chronicles, sermons, and personal letters from across Europe revealed how communities processed their trauma through narrative. The Chronicle of the Black Death by Jean de Venette combined factual reporting with theological interpretation, attempting to understand the epidemic within the framework of Christian providence, while acknowledging the inadequacy of traditional explanations for such unprecedented suffering. Vernacular poetry flourished in the plague's aftermath, as survivors sought to express experiences that seemed to exceed the capacity of conventional literary forms. The English poem Winner and Waster, composed around 1352, used allegorical debate to explore the economic disruptions that had followed demographic catastrophe. The poem's central conflict between figures representing conservation and consumption reflected real anxieties about how society should respond to the sudden abundance of resources that had become available through inheritance and abandonment. French literary responses to the plague included Guillaume de Machaut's Judgment of the King of Navarre, which explicitly addressed the epidemic's impact on courtly culture. Machaut's poem described a world where traditional chivalric values had been rendered meaningless by indiscriminate mortality that killed noble knights alongside common peasants. The work's exploration of whether conventional moral categories retained validity after such universal suffering influenced French literature for generations, establishing themes that would recur in works by Christine de Pizan and other late medieval authors. The development of memento mori themes in visual art represented one of the most profound artistic responses to the plague experience. These artistic motifs, which reminded viewers of mortality's inevitability, had existed in medieval art before the pandemic but gained unprecedented prominence and psychological intensity afterward. Church frescoes, manuscript illuminations, and sculptural programs began incorporating skulls, hourglasses, and other symbols of death with a frequency and explicitness that reflected the plague's psychological impact on European consciousness. The famous fresco cycle in the Camposanto of Pisa, painted by an unknown artist around 1350, exemplified this transformation in artistic sensibility. The Triumph of Death portrayed death as a winged demon wielding a scythe, cutting down figures from all social classes without regard for rank, wealth, or virtue. The fresco's detailed depiction of corpses in various stages of decay reflected the artist's direct observation of plague mortality, while its composition emphasised death's democratic character, a theme that resonated powerfully with viewers who'd witnessed similar scenes in their own communities. Tomb sculpture underwent revolutionary changes as patrons sought to commemorate plague victims while expressing new understandings of mortality and resurrection. The emergence of transy tombs, which depicted the deceased in states of physical decay, represented a dramatic departure from earlier sculptural traditions that had idealised the dead. The tomb of Cardinal Jean de la Grange in Avignon, completed around 1360, showed the cardinal's corpse being consumed by worms and serpents while his soul ascended to heaven above. This dual representation acknowledged both the physical reality of bodily corruption and the spiritual hope of resurrection, reflecting theological tensions that had been intensified by the plague experience. English tomb sculpture developed its own distinctive responses to plague mortality through the proliferation of cadaver monuments that showed the deceased as emaciated corpses wrapped in burial shrouds. The tomb of Archbishop Henry Chichely at Canterbury Cathedral, though completed in the 15th century, established conventions that had originated during the immediate post-plague period. These monuments forced viewers to confront the physical reality of death while providing opportunities for meditation on spiritual preparation for mortality that had become urgent concerns for plague survivors. The Dance of Death emerged as perhaps the most influential artistic motif of the post-plague period, appearing in paintings, sculptures, and literary works throughout Europe. This allegorical representation showed death leading figures from all social classes in a ceremonial dance, emphasizing mortality's universal character while critiquing social hierarchies that had been revealed as meaningless in the face of epidemic disease. The earliest known Dance of Death fresco, painted in the Cemetery of the Innocents in Paris around 1424, established iconographic conventions that would be repeated in hundreds of similar works across Europe. The Danse Macabre at Basel, painted on the walls of the Dominican convent around 1440, demonstrated how this artistic theme had evolved to address specific social concerns of the post-plague period. The Basel version included 43 different social types, from pope and emperor to peasant and child, each paired with a personification of death who delivered verses emphasizing the vanity of earthly distinctions. The work's detailed attention to contemporary costume and social roles reflected its function as social commentary, using the universal fact of mortality to critique inequalities that had persisted despite the plague's democratic devastation. Musical responses to the plague encompassed both liturgical compositions designed for memorial services and secular songs that expressed popular attitudes toward mortality and survival. The proliferation of requiem masses reflected the enormous demand for memorial services created by unprecedented mortality rates. Composers like Guillaume de Machaut developed new musical techniques for setting funeral texts, creating polyphonic structures that could accommodate the complex emotions experienced by plague survivors. Machaut's Messe de Nostre Dame though not explicitly composed for plague victims, established musical precedents that influenced funeral music throughout the later medieval period. The emergence of plague songs as a distinct musical genre reflected popular attempts to process epidemic trauma through familiar cultural forms. These compositions, typically performed by travelling musicians, combined traditional melodies with new lyrics that addressed plague experiences directly. The German song Media Vita in Mortis Sumus gained popularity throughout Northern Europe, its haunting melody providing a vehicle for communal expression of grief and anxiety. Similar songs appeared in French, English and Italian, suggesting that musical responses to plague had developed independently in different linguistic communities while sharing common themes and emotional content. The development of morality plays represented another significant cultural response to the plague's psychological impact. These dramatic works, which typically showed allegorical figures representing virtues and vices competing for human souls, addressed anxieties about spiritual preparation that had become urgent concerns for epidemic survivors. Everyman, the most famous English morality play, depicted its protagonist's desperate search for companions willing to accompany him to judgment after death's summons. The play's emphasis on good deeds as the only reliable preparation for death reflected theological concerns that had gained new relevance for audiences who had witnessed countless unprepared deaths during the plague years. The staging of morality plays often incorporated visual elements that referenced plague experiences directly. Death characters typically appeared as skeletal figures carrying scythes or arrows, imagery that had become familiar to audiences through their exposure to plague mortality. The play's emphasis on sudden death and spiritual unpreparedness addressed psychological traumas that remained vivid in community memory long after the epidemic's passage. Performance records from English towns show that morality plays gained particular popularity in communities that had experienced severe plague mortality, suggesting that these dramatic works served therapeutic functions for traumatized populations. French morality plays developed distinctive characteristics that reflected different cultural responses to plague trauma. La Danse Macabre des Femmes, performed in Paris during the late 14th century, extended the dance of death motif to theatrical performance while addressing gender-specific concerns about mortality and social role. The play's female characters, representing different social classes and life stages, each received visits from death who reminded them of mortality's universality while critiquing social conventions that had restricted women's opportunities. This theatrical exploration of gender and mortality reflected the real changes in women's social positions that had resulted from plague-related demographic disruptions. Architectural responses to the plague encompassed both immediate practical adaptations and long-term changes in building design that reflected new understandings of disease transmission and community organisation. The construction of plague hospitals represented the most direct architectural response to epidemic disease, though these institutions typically followed traditional hospital designs rather than incorporating innovations based on medical understanding of contagion. The Ospedale di San Giovanni in Florence, rebuilt after plague damage in the 1350s, expanded its capacity while maintaining the traditional cruciform layout that had characterized medieval hospital architecture. Church architecture underwent more subtle but significant changes as communities sought to accommodate new liturgical practices that had developed in response to plague mortality. The proliferation of chantry chapels, small architectural additions where priests could perform memorial masses for plague victims, reflected the enormous demand for commemorative services. These architectural modifications, typically added to existing church structures, created intimate spaces for private devotion while providing employment for the surplus clergy, who had survived the epidemic's devastating impact on religious communities. The design of urban cemeteries evolved dramatically in response to the burial crises created by mass mortality. Traditional churchyard burials, which had accommodated normal mortality rates for centuries, proved completely inadequate when daily death tolls reached hundreds in major cities. The expansion of existing cemeteries and creation of new burial grounds required architectural solutions that could accommodate unprecedented numbers of graves while maintaining religious requirements for consecrated burial. The Cemetery of the Innocents in Paris expanded multiple times during the post-plague period, developed innovative techniques for maximizing burial capacity through the construction of charnel houses where older remains could be stored to make room for new burials. Urban planning began incorporating lessons learned from plague experiences, though these changes developed gradually over several generations rather than immediately following the epidemic. The widening of streets in cities like Florence and Siena reflected emerging understanding that crowded conditions had facilitated disease transmission, though planners lacked specific knowledge of bacterial infection mechanisms. The creation of public squares and market areas that could accommodate commercial activity while reducing population density represented practical responses to plague experiences that would influence urban development for centuries. Hospital architecture evolved to incorporate primitive isolation procedures that had developed during plague outbreaks. The Ospedale Maggiore in Milan, begun in the 1450s, included separate wards for different types of patients based on observations that certain diseases seemed more contagious than others. While medieval physicians lacked understanding of bacterial transmission, their practical experience with plague had taught them that isolation could sometimes limit disease spread. These architectural innovations established precedents for hospital design that would eventually evolve into modern infection control practices. The construction of quarantine facilities represented the most innovative architectural response to plague experiences. Venice's Lazaretto, established on the island of Santa Maria de Nazareth, created the first purpose-built quarantine station in European history. The facility's design incorporated dormitories for travellers, warehouses for goods, administrative offices for health officials, and a chapel for religious services, all arranged to minimise contact between different groups while maintaining necessary functions. The architectural solutions developed at the Venetian Lazaretto influenced quarantine facility design throughout the Mediterranean and established principles that would guide public health architecture for centuries. The cultural and artistic responses to the Black Death represented more than mere documentation of epidemic experiences. They constituted fundamental transformations in European consciousness that would influence cultural development for centuries to come. The emergence of new literary genres, artistic motifs, musical forms, and architectural solutions reflected society's attempts to process unprecedented trauma, while creating cultural frameworks that could accommodate new understandings of mortality, social organisation, and human relationships. These cultural innovations established traditions that would continue evolving long after the immediate plague crisis had passed, demonstrating the pandemic's profound and lasting impact on European civilization. The great mortality of 1347 to 1351 had barely subsided when European communities began experiencing a cruel revelation. The Black Death was not a singular catastrophe, but the beginning of a recurring nightmare that would haunt the continent for generations. The first major return of plague struck in 1361 to 1362, arriving with such ferocity that contemporary chroniclers dubbed it the Second Pestilence, or, more ominously, the Children's Plague, due to its devastating impact on the generation born after the initial outbreak. Unlike their parents, who had survived the first pandemic and developed some measure of immunity, children possessed no biological defences against Yersinia pestis, making them particularly vulnerable to this renewed assault. The 1361 to 1362 outbreak followed patterns that would become grimly familiar over the following century and a half. Ships arriving at Mediterranean ports carried infected rats and fleas that had maintained the plague cycle in North African and Middle Eastern reservoirs, where the disease had never fully disappeared. Venetian trade records from the summer of 1361 document the arrival of galleys from Alexandria and Constantinople, whose crews reported unusual mortality during their voyages, though port authorities had not yet developed systematic procedures for identifying and isolating potentially infected vessels. The disease spread rapidly through Italy's commercial networks, reaching Florence by August and Paris by October of the same year. The demographic impact of this second outbreak proved particularly severe because it struck populations that had not yet recovered from the initial pandemic's devastation. English manorial records show that many villages that had lost half their inhabitants during 1348 to 1349 experienced additional mortality rates of 30% during 1361 to 1362, effectively preventing any meaningful population recovery. The manor of Halesowen in Worcestershire, which had recorded 800 adult males before the first plague, counted only 180 after the second outbreak, a reduction of nearly 80% over the 14-year period. Similar patterns appeared throughout Europe, creating demographic depressions that would persist well into the 15th century. The children born between 1350 and 1360 faced mortality rates approaching those experienced by adults during the initial pandemic. The Chronicle of Jean de Venette recorded that Parisian parishes lost between 40 and 60% of their children under age 12 during the autumn and winter of 1361 to 1362. These youngsters, who had grown up hearing stories of the great mortality but had never experienced epidemic disease themselves, possessed none of the behavioural adaptations that had helped some adults survive the first outbreak. They continued playing together in groups, sharing food and sleeping arrangements, and maintaining close physical contact that facilitated rapid disease transmission. The psychological impact of losing an entire generation of children proved devastating for communities that had invested enormous emotional energy in rebuilding their societies around these young survivors. Parents who had endured the loss of spouses, siblings, and friends during the first plague now watched helplessly as their children succumbed to the same disease. The chronicler Henry Knighton described English villages where the sound of children's voices, which had begun to return to the streets after the great mortality, fell silent once again, leaving only the grief of parents who had twice lost everything dear to them. The economic consequences of the children's plague extended far beyond immediate mortality to encompass the destruction of long-term demographic recovery strategies. Rural communities that had encouraged early marriage and large families to rebuild their populations saw these efforts negated when the children who represented their future died before reaching reproductive age. Urban craft guilds that had relaxed apprenticeship requirements to attract young workers found their workshops emptied once again, forcing masters to abandon plans for expanding production. The careful negotiations between landlords and tenants that had established new agricultural arrangements following the first plague required renegotiation, as families that had seemed stable disintegrated under renewed mortality. The third major outbreak of 1369 demonstrated how plague had become endemic to European disease ecology, capable of erupting from local reservoirs without requiring reintroduction from distant sources. This epidemic appeared first in England during the spring, spreading rapidly through trade networks to reach the continent by summer. Unlike the previous outbreaks, which had followed established commercial routes from the Mediterranean northward, the 1369 plague seemed to emerge simultaneously from multiple locations, suggesting that the disease had established permanent footholds in European rodent populations. French royal records document the 1369 outbreak's impact on the ongoing Hundred Years' War, as military campaigns ground to a halt when soldiers began dying of plague faster than they could be recruited. The English army besieging the fortress of Limoges abandoned their siege when plague struck their camp, killing an estimated 2,000 soldiers within 3 weeks. Similar disruptions affected French forces, creating a temporary cessation of hostilities that had nothing to do with diplomatic negotiations and everything to do with the biological impossibility of maintaining armies in the face of epidemic disease. The 1375 outbreak, sometimes called the Fourth Pestilence by contemporary chroniclers, revealed how European societies had begun developing more sophisticated responses to recurring plague while simultaneously demonstrating the limitations of medieval public health measures. Italian cities that had implemented quarantine procedures during previous outbreaks expanded their isolation facilities and refined their inspection protocols. Venice's lazaretto system, which had evolved from emergency measures during the First Plague, now operated as a permanent institution with dedicated staff, standardized procedures, and architectural features specifically designed for epidemic control. The Venetian quarantine system of 1375 required all ships arriving from potentially infected ports to anchor at the lazaretto for 40 days of observation before crew and cargo could enter the city proper. The facility on Santa Maria di Nazareth had expanded to include separate dormitories for different classes of travellers, warehouses equipped with ventilation systems for airing potentially contaminated goods, and administrative offices where health commissioners maintained detailed records of arrivals, deaths, and releases. The island's chapel provided religious services for quarantined individuals, while its cemetery accommodated those who died during isolation, creating a complete community dedicated to disease control. The effectiveness of Venice's quarantine measures became apparent when comparing mortality rates between cities that had implemented systematic isolation procedures and those that had not. Venice experienced death rates of approximately 20% during the 1375 outbreak, significantly lower than the 40% mortality recorded in cities like Genoa and Pisa that had not developed comparable public health infrastructure. These differences encouraged other Italian cities to establish their own quarantine facilities, leading to a network of lazarettos throughout the Mediterranean that represented medieval Europe's most successful public health innovation. Florence developed alternative approaches to plague control that emphasized urban sanitation and population management rather than maritime quarantine. The city's government, reconstituted after the devastating losses of previous outbreaks, implemented regulations requiring the removal of refuse from streets, the cleaning of public wells, and the burial of animal carcasses outside city walls. These measures, while based on incorrect theories about disease transmission through corrupted air, achieved some success in reducing urban rat populations and limiting the spread of plague-carrying fleas. The Florentine authorities also developed primitive epidemiological tracking methods that attempted to identify patterns in plague transmission. City officials maintained registers recording the location, timing, and demographic characteristics of plague cases, creating databases that allowed them to identify neighbourhoods at high risk and implement targeted interventions. While their understanding of disease causation remained fundamentally flawed, these record-keeping practices established precedents for systematic disease surveillance that would eventually evolve into modern epidemiological methods. Regional variations in plague recurrence patterns began emerging as different areas developed distinct relationships with the endemic disease. Northern European cities, particularly those connected to Baltic and North Sea trade networks, experienced plague outbreaks approximately every 10-15 years, with mortality rates that gradually declined as populations developed partial immunity through repeated exposure. The Hanseatic League cities of Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bergen recorded detailed mortality statistics that revealed this pattern of decreasing virulence over time. Though each outbreak continued to cause significant economic disruption and social upheaval, Mediterranean regions, which maintained closer contact with Middle Eastern and North African plague reservoirs, faced more frequent outbreaks but also developed more sophisticated control measures. Cities like Marseille, Barcelona, and Palermo experienced plague episodes every 5-7 years on average, but their mortality rates remained relatively stable rather than declining, suggesting that constant reintroduction from external sources prevented the development of local population immunity. These cities invested heavily in quarantine infrastructure and developed international cooperation agreements for sharing information about plague outbreaks in distant ports. The development of local immunity patterns varied significantly based on population density, trade connections, and environmental factors. Rural areas with limited external contacts sometimes avoided plague for decades after initial outbreaks, but when the disease eventually arrived, it caused mortality rates comparable to those experienced during the first pandemic. The village of Givry in Burgundy, which had lost 40% of its population during 1348 to 1349, remained plague-free until 1400, when a new outbreak killed another 35% of residents who lacked any previous exposure to the disease. Urban populations that experienced regular plague outbreaks gradually developed partial immunity that manifested in several ways. Children who survived mild cases of bubonic plague during early outbreaks often proved resistant to later infections, creating age-specific mortality patterns where plague increasingly affected the very young and very old, while sparing adults in their prime working years. This demographic selectivity allowed cities to maintain economic productivity even during plague years, as the core workforce remained relatively stable despite ongoing mortality. The evolution of medical understanding and treatment practices reflected centuries of accumulated experience with recurring plague outbreaks. Physicians who had observed multiple epidemics began recognizing patterns in symptom development, disease progression, and treatment outcomes that allowed them to provide more effective care. The medical treatise Regimen contra pestilentiam by John of Burgundy, written around 1380, synthesized decades of clinical experience to provide practical guidance for plague treatment that achieved better results than earlier theoretical approaches. Medical practitioners developed empirical treatments that, while still based on incorrect theories about disease causation, proved more effective than the bloodletting and purgation that had characterized early plague responses. Physicians began recommending bed rest, adequate nutrition, and pain relief for bubo sufferers, approaches that supported patients' immune systems rather than weakening them further. The use of opium-based preparations for pain management, while not addressing plague's underlying pathology, improved patients' comfort and may have reduced stress-related mortality. The establishment of specialized plague hospitals represented another significant medical innovation that emerged from repeated epidemic experience. These institutions, distinct from general hospitals that served multiple medical conditions, developed protocols specifically designed for plague care. The Ospedale di San Sebastiano in Milan, founded in 1420, included isolation wards that separated different types of plague cases, ventilation systems designed to prevent disease transmission, and staff training programs that taught infection control procedures based on empirical observation rather than medical theory. Surgical treatment of buboes evolved considerably as physicians gained experience with different intervention techniques. Rather than the aggressive lancing that had characterized early plague treatment, surgeons developed more conservative approaches that allowed buboes to drain naturally while providing pain relief and preventing secondary infection. These refined surgical techniques, combined with improved wound care practices, increased survival rates among bubonic plague patients from approximately 40% during the first pandemic to nearly 60% by the late 14th century. The social and economic adaptations that European societies developed in response to recurring plague represented fundamental transformations in medieval civilization. Agricultural systems evolved toward greater flexibility and resilience, with landlords maintaining larger reserves of seed grain and livestock to ensure rapid recovery after plague outbreaks. The consolidation of land holdings that had begun after the first pandemic continued throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, creating more efficient agricultural units that could maintain production despite periodic labour shortages. urban craft production adapted to recurring plague through the development of more flexible guild structures that could accommodate rapid changes in membership and production capacity. Master craftsmen began training multiple apprentices simultaneously rather than following traditional one-to-one relationships, ensuring that technical knowledge would survive even if individual masters died during plague outbreaks. Guild regulations evolved to permit temporary partnerships between workshops during epidemic periods, allowing surviving craftsmen to pool resources and maintain production levels. The financial systems that supported European commerce developed sophisticated mechanisms for managing plague-related disruptions. Italian banking houses created insurance products that protected merchants against losses caused by epidemic mortality, while credit arrangements included clauses that suspended payment obligations during plague years. These financial innovations allowed commercial networks to maintain stability despite recurring demographic catastrophes, contributing to the economic recovery that characterized the late medieval period. Population recovery patterns varied significantly across European regions, reflecting differences in plague frequency, mortality rates, and economic opportunities. England's population, which had fallen from approximately 4 million in 1300 to perhaps 2.5 million after the First Plague, stabilised at around 3 million by 1450 despite recurring outbreaks. This demographic recovery occurred primarily through increased fertility rates among survivors rather than immigration, as couples married younger and had larger families during plague-free intervals. France experienced more complex demographic patterns due to the interaction between plague mortality and ongoing warfare with England. The kingdom's population declined from an estimated 17 million in 1300 to approximately 10 million by 1450, with recurring plague preventing full recovery despite periods of relative peace. The demographic depression proved particularly severe in northern France, where English military campaigns had compounded plague mortality, while southern regions that avoided major military action recovered more successfully. The Holy Roman Empire's fragmented political structure created diverse demographic experiences as different territories developed varying responses to recurring plague. The Hanseatic cities of northern Germany maintained relatively stable populations through effective quarantine measures and commercial diversification, while rural areas in Bavaria and Austria experienced continued population decline well into the 15th century. The empire's overall population probably stabilised at approximately 60% of pre-plague levels by 1450, though significant regional variations persisted. Italian city-states achieved the most successful demographic recoveries, with populations in Florence, Venice and Genoa approaching pre-plague levels by 1450, despite recurring outbreaks. This recovery reflected the effectiveness of Italian public health measures, the resilience of Mediterranean commercial networks, and the economic opportunities created by reduced competition from northern European producers. Italian success in managing recurring plague established these cities as dominant forces in European commerce and culture during the Renaissance period. The long-term cultural impact of recurring plague extended far beyond demographic statistics to encompass fundamental changes in European mentality and social organisation. The certainty of periodic epidemic mortality created a culture of contingency planning and risk management that influenced everything from family formation strategies to architectural design. Europeans learned to live with the knowledge that plague could return at any time, developing psychological and institutional mechanisms for coping with recurring catastrophe that would influence European civilization for centuries to come. The demographic catastrophe and recurring plague outbreaks that had devastated Europe between 1347 and 1450 created the conditions for one of history's most profound social transformations. By the mid-15th century, the rigid hierarchical structures that had defined medieval society for centuries were crumbling under pressures that no amount of traditional authority could contain. The acute labour shortages that persisted long after the initial plague mortality had fundamentally shifted the balance of power between social classes, creating opportunities for advancement that would have been unthinkable in the densely populated world of 1300. The decline of serfdom accelerated dramatically as landlords found themselves unable to maintain the complex web of labour obligations that had bound peasants to their manors for generations. In England, where manorial records provide the most detailed documentation of this transformation, the proportion of unfree peasants fell from approximately 70% of the rural population in 1300 to less than 20% by 1450. The process occurred through multiple mechanisms: formal manumission as lords sought to attract scarce workers with offers of freedom, abandonment as peasants simply walked away from their obligations to seek better opportunities elsewhere, and legal challenges as village communities used their enhanced bargaining power to contest traditional restrictions in royal courts. The manor of Ramsey Abbey in Huntingdonshire exemplified this transformation. Before the plague, the abbey's extensive estates had been worked primarily through customary labour services, with peasants owing 2 to 3 days of work per week on the lord's domain in exchange for their holdings. By 1400, the abbey had converted virtually all these labour obligations to money rents, while former serfs who had accumulated capital through favourable wage rates began leasing additional lands as commercial tenants. The abbey's account rolls reveal that cash rents provided more reliable income than labour services, while the former serfs achieved living standards that approached those of minor gentry. The emergence of wage labour as the dominant form of agricultural employment represented a fundamental break with medieval economic traditions. Before the plague, most rural work had been organised through reciprocal obligations between lords and peasants, with money payments playing only a supplementary role. The demographic crisis forced a transition to cash relationships that gave both parties greater flexibility, while fundamentally altering the social meaning of work itself. Peasants who had previously worked their lord's land as a feudal obligation now sold their labour for wages that reflected market conditions rather than customary arrangements. Agricultural wages increased by 200 to 300% in many regions during the century, following the initial plague outbreak, creating unprecedented prosperity for surviving rural workers. The account books of Battle Abbey in Sussex show daily wages for harvest workers rising from 3 pence in 1340 to 8 pence by 1380, while similar increases occurred throughout England's agricultural regions. These wage gains persisted despite recurring plague outbreaks because population recovery remained insufficient to restore pre-plague labour abundance. Rural workers used their enhanced bargaining power to demand not only higher wages, but also improved working conditions, better food allowances, and greater autonomy over their daily activities. The consolidation of agricultural holdings created a new class of prosperous peasants who accumulated substantial properties through inheritance, purchase, and lease arrangements. The 100 rolls for the village of Wistow in Huntingdonshire show that 5 families controlled nearly 60% of the village's arable land by 1450, compared to a much more even distribution before the plague. These successful peasants began operating as small-scale commercial farmers, hiring wage labourers, investing in improved agricultural techniques, and marketing their surplus production in regional centres. Their economic success challenged traditional social hierarchies by creating wealth that rivaled that of minor nobility, while remaining technically within the peasant class. The transformation of urban labour markets proved even more dramatic as craft guilds lost their ability to control production and employment through traditional apprenticeship systems. The guild structure, which had regulated urban economic life for centuries through strict membership requirements and production quotas, faced collapse when master craftsmen died faster than they could train replacements. Surviving workers found themselves in positions to demand guild membership and master status that would normally have required decades of gradual advancement. London's various craft guilds admitted hundreds of emergency members during the post-plague period, as organisations that had previously restricted membership to maintain artificial scarcity were forced to accept any qualified workers they could find. The breakdown of guild restrictions created opportunities for economic innovation that had been suppressed under the traditional system of regulated production. Craftsmen who had been limited to specific techniques and materials by guild regulations began experimenting with new methods that increased productivity while reducing labour requirements. The textile industry saw rapid adoption of water-powered machinery as producers sought to maintain output with reduced workforces. Watermills for fulling cloth, which had faced opposition from workers who feared unemployment, gained acceptance as labour shortages made mechanisation economically attractive rather than socially disruptive. Women's participation in craft production increased dramatically as traditional gender restrictions became impractical in the face of acute labour shortages. Guild records from Paris, London, and other major cities document women taking over businesses previously operated by their deceased husbands, often continuing production with female workers who had been excluded from formal guild membership. The brewing industry, which had traditionally employed women in subordinate roles, saw female brewers establishing independent operations that competed directly with male-dominated guild enterprises. These women achieved economic independence that would have been impossible under normal demographic conditions, creating precedents for female business ownership that would influence urban development for generations. The emergence of early capitalist relationships became apparent in the development of putting out systems that connected rural producers with urban merchants through cash payments rather than traditional reciprocal obligations. Merchants who had accumulated capital during the post-plague period began distributing raw materials to rural households, paying piece rates for finished goods that were then marketed in distant cities. This system allowed merchants to exploit the lower labour costs available in rural areas while providing peasant families with supplementary income that enhanced their economic security. The arrangement represented a fundamental departure from medieval economic relationships by creating pure market transactions divorced from personal or feudal obligations. The concentration of capital in the hands of successful survivors created new forms of investment that would characterize early modern economic development. Italian merchants who had weathered the plague's disruption of traditional commercial networks used their accumulated resources to establish manufacturing operations that employed wage workers rather than guild craftsmen. The Medici family's expansion into textile production during the late 14th century exemplified this transformation as they established workshops that operated outside traditional guild structures while employing hundreds of workers on a pure wage basis. These enterprises achieved economies of scale that allowed them to compete successfully with traditional craft production while generating profits that could be reinvested in further expansion. The political transformations that accompanied these economic changes proved equally fundamental in reshaping European governance structures. The demographic crisis had weakened traditional feudal relationships by eliminating many of the noble families who had provided local leadership while simultaneously strengthening the bargaining power of surviving peasant communities. Royal governments found themselves dealing with more assertive rural populations who demanded greater representation in exchange for the taxes and military service that monarchs required for effective governance. The strengthening of centralized monarchies occurred partly through the elimination of intermediate levels of feudal authority that had traditionally mediated between royal power and local communities. The deaths of numerous noble families during plague outbreaks created opportunities for monarchs to assert direct control over territories that had previously been governed through complex feudal hierarchies. The French monarchy's gradual absorption of autonomous duchies and counties during the 14th and 15th centuries reflected this process, as royal officials replaced deceased feudal lords who had no clear heirs or whose surviving relatives lack the resources to maintain traditional authority. Taxation systems underwent revolutionary changes as monarchs adapted to the economic transformations created by demographic catastrophe. The traditional reliance on feudal obligations and customary payments proved inadequate when the social relationships that had supported these arrangements no longer existed. Royal governments began developing more systematic tax collection methods that dealt directly with individual property holders rather than working through feudal intermediaries. The French taille, which evolved from an emergency war tax into a regular source of royal revenue, exemplified this transformation by creating direct relationships between the monarchy and tax-paying subjects that bypassed traditional feudal hierarchies. The evolution of representative institutions reflected the enhanced bargaining power that surviving populations had gained through their scarcity value in the post-plague economy. The English Parliament's increased influence during the 14th and 15th centuries resulted partly from the monarchy's need to negotiate with communities that possessed unprecedented leverage due to their reduced numbers and enhanced economic importance. The Commons' ability to demand political concessions in exchange for tax grants reflected the fundamental shift in power relationships that had occurred as a result of demographic transformation. Parliamentary representation evolved to reflect the new social realities created by plague mortality and economic change. The English House of Commons began including representatives from prosperous peasant communities whose economic success had elevated them to positions of local prominence, while traditional noble families found their political influence diminished by reduced resources and population. The borough constituencies that elected members to Parliament increasingly represented commercial interests rather than traditional feudal relationships, creating a more diverse political body that reflected the economic transformations of the post-plague period. French representative institutions developed along similar lines as the Estates General adapted to include voices from the emerging commercial and agricultural classes that had gained prominence through post-plague economic opportunities. The Third Estate, which had traditionally represented urban merchants and wealthy peasants, expanded to include the new class of prosperous farmers and rural entrepreneurs who had accumulated substantial properties through the demographic crisis. These representatives brought different priorities and perspectives to national politics, emphasizing commercial development and individual property rights rather than traditional feudal obligations. The development of more sophisticated administrative systems reflected monarchs' needs to govern populations that were both smaller and more assertive than their medieval predecessors. Royal bureaucracies expanded their record-keeping capabilities to track individual property holders and tax obligations, rather than relying on feudal intermediaries to manage these relationships. The French Royal Chancery developed systematic procedures for documenting land transfers, commercial agreements, and legal disputes that had previously been handled through local customary arrangements. These administrative innovations created the foundation for early modern state development by establishing direct relationships between central governments and individual subjects. The religious and intellectual consequences of the plague experience proved equally transformative in reshaping European thought and culture. The massive mortality that had struck clergy and educated elites during successive plague outbreaks created opportunities for new ideas that challenged traditional scholastic philosophy and theological orthodoxy. The deaths of established intellectual authorities, combined with the obvious inadequacy of traditional explanations for epidemic catastrophe, created space for alternative approaches to understanding the natural world and human society. The decline of scholastic philosophy reflected the broader crisis of traditional authority that had accompanied the demographic catastrophe. The elaborate theological systems developed by Thomas Aquinas and other medieval thinkers had provided comprehensive explanations for natural phenomena and social organization based on the integration of Aristotelian philosophy with Christian doctrine. However, the plague's indiscriminate mortality, which killed virtuous clergy alongside notorious sinners, challenged fundamental assumptions about divine justice and providential order that formed the foundation of scholastic thought. The University of Paris, which had served as the centre of scholastic learning, lost more than half its faculty during the plague years, creating opportunities for new intellectual approaches that would not have been possible under normal circumstances. The rise of nominalism represented one of the most significant intellectual developments of the post-plague period. Nominalist philosophers like William of Ockham and John Duns Scotus argued that universal concepts existed only as names rather than as real entities, challenging the scholastic belief in objective moral and natural order. This philosophical position gained credibility partly because the plague experience had demonstrated the apparent randomness of natural events and the inadequacy of traditional explanations for understanding causation. Nominalist emphasis on individual experience and empirical observation provided intellectual frameworks that would eventually support the development of experimental science and individualistic social theories. The emergence of Renaissance humanism reflected the broader cultural transformation that had resulted from the plague's disruption of traditional social and intellectual hierarchies. Humanist scholars like Petrarch and Boccaccio emphasized the study of classical texts and the celebration of human achievement rather than the theological concerns that had dominated medieval learning. Their approach gained popularity partly because traditional religious explanations had proven inadequate for understanding the plague experience, while classical authors like Thucydides and Lucretius had provided more satisfying accounts of epidemic disease and social disruption. The development of vernacular literature and learning accelerated as the plague's impact on Latin-educated clergy created opportunities for lay intellectuals to assume greater prominence in cultural life. The deaths of numerous monks and clerics who had maintained medieval libraries and scriptoria created gaps in traditional learning that were filled by secular scholars writing in vernacular languages. The success of works like Boccaccio's Decameron and Chaucer's Canterbury Tales demonstrated that serious literature could address contemporary social realities in languages accessible to the emerging merchant and artisan classes who had gained prominence through post-plague economic opportunities. The transformation of educational institutions reflected the broader social changes that had resulted from demographic catastrophe and economic restructuring. Universities that had previously served primarily to train clergy began attracting students from merchant and artisan families who sought practical education for commercial careers. The curriculum gradually expanded to include subjects like mathematics, natural philosophy, and rhetoric that had practical applications in business and administration, while traditional theological studies declined in relative importance. These changes created more diverse intellectual communities that were receptive to new ideas and approaches. The development of printing technology during the 15th century both reflected and accelerated the intellectual transformations that had begun during the plague period. The demand for books had increased as literacy spread among the commercial classes who had gained prominence through post-plague economic opportunities, while the disruption of traditional scriptorial production had created market opportunities for mechanical reproduction. Printing allowed for the rapid dissemination of new ideas while reducing the costs of education and information, creating conditions that would support the further development of Renaissance culture and eventually the Protestant Reformation. The Black Death's role in ending the High Middle Ages and catalysing the transition to the early modern period became apparent in the fundamental restructuring of European society that had occurred by 1450. The demographic catastrophe had eliminated the population pressure that had characterised medieval civilization while creating economic opportunities that transformed social relationships and political structures. The traditional feudal system based on land scarcity and labour abundance gave way to more flexible arrangements that emphasised individual achievement and market relationships, rather than hereditary status and customary obligations. The economic changes that had begun with acute post-plague labour shortages evolved into permanent structural transformations that would characterise early modern European development. The emergence of wage labour, commercial agriculture, and capitalist investment created economic relationships that were fundamentally different from medieval patterns. These changes provided the foundation for the commercial expansion and technological innovation that would eventually enable European global exploration and colonisation, while the political centralisation that had resulted from feudal disruption created the state structures necessary for early modern military and administrative development. The cultural and intellectual transformations that had emerged from the plague experience established patterns of thought that would influence European development for centuries. The emphasis on individual experience and empirical observation that had developed partly in response to the inadequacy of traditional explanations for epidemic catastrophe provided intellectual foundations for the scientific revolution and enlightenment. The vernacular literature and humanistic learning that had flourished during the post-plague period created cultural traditions that would support Renaissance artistic achievement and eventually Protestant emphasis on individual religious experience. The Black Death thus represented far more than a demographic catastrophe. It constituted a fundamental watershed in European historical development that separated the medieval world from the early modern period. The pandemic's immediate mortality created the conditions for social, economic, and political transformations that would have been impossible under normal demographic circumstances. The recurring outbreaks that followed ensured that these changes became permanent features of European civilization rather than temporary adjustments to crisis. By 1500, Europe had emerged as a fundamentally different society from the one that had existed in 1300, possessing the social flexibility, economic dynamism, and intellectual curiosity that would enable its remarkable expansion and influence during the following centuries. The plague's legacy lived on not merely in the memory of past suffering but in the transformed structures of European civilization that would shape the modern world.